That evening, when Scott came out of the Transfiguration classroom, he saw Harry waving from around the corner at the far end of the corridor. Ron and Hermione were with him. Scott walked over. "Scott, the verdict's out," Harry said. His face looked grim. "The result is just like you said. Hagrid's all right, but Buckbeak's been sentenced to death." Just as Scott had expected. He asked, "When will they carry it out?" "Hagrid said it's the day before the Christmas holidays," Hermione replied. Harry looked at Scott pleadingly. "Is there any good way to save Buckbeak?" Scott shook his head. Harry's face fell. "There's really no way. Hagrid'll be devastated." "There is a way to save Buckbeak," Scott said quietly, "but it would be illegal." Harry and Ron's eyes lit up. Hermione was immediately furious. "No, no, we can't do that," she snapped. She stared at Harry and Ron with blazing anger. "You'd get arrested," Ron bristled. "If Scott says there's a way, there must be a way that won't land us in prison." "There isn't," Hermione hissed. "Who knows if we'd be discovered?" Scott held up a hand, making them lower their voices. "The only safe way would involve Hermione," he said, looking pointedly at her. "Honestly, I don't recommend doing it." "What way?" Harry and Ron both turned to Hermione. She said quickly, "No, don't even think about it." She glared at Scott. "Professor McGonagall trusted me with something. I can't just misuse it." Scott smiled without humor. "I said leave it to your own judgment. I still don't recommend it." Hermione's anger sharpened. "You shouldn't have mentioned it at all. This has to be kept secret. If you have a way to save that poor creature, why not use it?" Ron said, baffled. "You don't know anything," Hermione snapped at him. "And if you try—" Scott watched the three of them with a helpless expression and a quiet gesture to be careful. Hermione turned on him, fierce. "I told you, you don't know what you're talking about." She spun and ran off down the corridor. "Why is she so angry?" Ron asked, bewildered. Harry's face was complicated. "You shouldn't have pushed her like that, Ron. We should have asked her properly." "Asked what?" Ron pouted. "She already said no." Harry looked at Scott as if to blame him. Scott walked up, patted Harry on the shoulder, and said, "Maybe the best thing is to focus on helping Hagrid through this, making him stronger." Then he walked away. He had given them a possible option. What they chose to do was not his concern. He wouldn't take part. Back in the dormitory, Eddie intercepted him with a conspiratorial grin. "Scott, I asked some Slytherins about those cousins from the Carrow and Roar families," he announced proudly. Scott raised an eyebrow. "What did you find out?" "They did go to Durmstrang," Eddie said, "and Carrow is still in contact with a few Slytherins." "And," Scott prompted, Eddie adopted a relish for gossip. "Someone said Carrow might have returned to Hogwarts, but his cousin didn't want to come back, so he followed her to Durmstrang." "How's that possible?" Roger, nearby, scoffed. "Carrow was expelled for attacking Scott. He even stayed in the Ministry dungeon for a bit. He couldn't just come back to Hogwarts." Scott felt skeptical too. Dumbledore had the final say at the school. Eddie shrugged. "This is what some Slytherins are saying, specifically the two who used to ambush Scott with Carrow on the stone bridge. They were Carrow's cronies." "They're just bragging," Roger said. "Anyway, that's not the important thing." Eddie gave Roger a look of wounded pride, as if Roger had missed the point entirely. Roger returned the glare. Eddie chuckled with a touch of schadenfreude. "The point is, though Carrow and Roll have been engaged since childhood, it's one-sided. Carrow likes Roll, but Roll isn't keen on him." He leaned in. "Everyone knows it. Roll's always been cold to Carrow. Even when she had to dance with him at a banquet, she showed how unwilling she was. She even complained about the engagement openly. Carrow, though, has been obedient and doting since they were kids. Their family has been embarrassed by Roll's resistance. They considered finding another fiancé for him, but Carrow refused. He even defied his father over it." Scott nodded. If this wasn't a clear case of simping, what was? If the gossip were true, the drama could be even better than he'd imagined. He found himself oddly looking forward to it. Roger and Milton, who didn't know Scott's plans, weren't very interested. "We don't know if any of that is true," Roger said, disappointed. "Even if it is, Carrow would only be a bit embarrassed." "Yeah," Milton agreed. "It won't really punish them." Eddie looked deflated. "This was top-secret stuff I dug up. Those two families keep things tight. If it spreads, both the Carrow family and the Roar family would be mortified." But just mortified, Roger said, shrugging. Caro's probably used to it. Scott thanked Eddie. He knew Eddie had gone out of his way to dig up dirt on Caro and Roll to help him vent. He had to admire the kid. You're a Ravenclaw and Muggle-born, and yet you can pry secrets out of Slytherins, Scott told him. That's a skill. Roger and Milton agreed enthusiastically, and Eddie basked in the praise. 322. Helena's Help. A week before the Christmas holidays, Lambeau told Scott that he and the Ravens had found the locations of the Caro and Roar families. Not just the Caros and Roars, Lambeau said. The Foley family held a banquet, and we followed those carriages to the homes of quite a few other families. Of course, that's not the interesting part, he added. The Foley family? Scott asked. They're one of the 3 families contending for the Travers inheritance. Has something changed with them? Lambeau got to the point. People from the Yaxley family attended the Foley banquet. I saw the head of the Yaxleys talking very happily with the Foley representative. Scott was surprised. Had the 3-way rivalry cooled down, or had the Foley and Yaxley families joined forces? It wasn't impossible. After Jack Yaxley's death, the Yaxleys no longer had a legitimate candidate to inherit the Travers estate. Their involvement in the contest could be aimed more at preserving face than at true influence. If they decided to back the Foleys now, they could still expect compensation later, an attractive option. With the 2 families allied, the Bulstrode's chances would shrink considerably. Scott clicked his tongue. He had secretly stoked the competition over the Travers inheritance, partly to strike back at the Yaxleys, but he hadn't expected them to start cooperating so soon. This doesn't prove anything, he said. Ownership of the Travers fortune is still unsettled. Other families and elements in the ministry are still pushing for it. Even as he spoke, Scott knew that the Foley family's chosen heir now had the best chance. Only the Foleys, Bulstrodes, and Yaxleys were connected to the Traverses by marriage, and only their nominees carried any Travers blood. The ministry's involvement amounted to pressure rather than a legitimate blood claim, and the ministry itself was no monolith. Internal factions and the interests of various pureblood houses made for a tangled web. Keep an eye on them, Scott told Lambeau. And besides the tasks on the Caro family, I want to know what made the Yaxleys side with the Foleys, why they're acting as if Jack Yaxley's death doesn't matter. Lambeau understood and nodded. He joked, maybe the Travers family found out Jack was assassinated by someone in the Bulstrodes. Scott laughed. Others didn't know how Jack Yaxley had died, but as the man responsible, he knew perfectly well. The revenge he'd set in motion seemed to be taking an unexpected turn, but he wasn't impatient. The Yaxleys had probably written him off, thinking the small wizard was no longer a threat. He had time to replan. After saying goodbye to Lambeau, Scott ran into Professor Grapeland as he left the Forbidden Forest. This time, she was coming from Hagrid's hut. Scott greeted her. She was used to students wandering in the forest and made a few jokes before letting him go. He had been planning to ask Professor Dumbledore about the identity of the new assistant professor in care of magical creatures, but finding the headmaster at Hogwarts was never easy. Dumbledore was a busy man and rarely appeared to students. Besides, after their last conversation, Scott felt awkward about going to the headmaster's office. Dumbledore's advice had been well-meaning, but he couldn't change on command. He wandered the castle and found Helena in the garden. "Good afternoon, Helena," he said. She looked up from a flower bed. "Yes?" "It's about Miss Grapeland, the assistant professor in care of magical creatures," Scott said, sitting on a stone bench. Helena blinked, then remembered. "Her? As far as I know, Wilhelmina Grapeland graduated from Gryffindor," Scott said. "But the assistant professor's magic feels more Ravenclaw than Gryffindor." Helena looked surprised. "You mean the assistant professor isn't the Wilhelmina everyone remembers?" "Oh, Grapeland." She murmured the name and thought for a moment. Ravenclaw did have a Grapeland once, Stephanie Grapeland. She must have graduated nearly 10 years ago. Perhaps the assistant professor is actually Stephanie, not Wilhelmina. Are they sisters? Scott asked. Probably, Helena said uncertainly. I don't pay much attention to who's related to whom. She paused, then looked down at him. Do you want me to bring it up with Professor Dumbledore? Scott nodded. I'd rather not go to the headmaster's office myself. I don't like it either, Helena said. All right. With that, she floated back into the castle. Scott watched her go and then strolled out of the garden. That evening, he found Helena again in the Ravenclaw Common Room library. I've already asked Professor Dumbledore, she told him. He knows. Wilhelmina was injured on an expedition, and her sister Stephanie is filling in as assistant professor. She said it plainly, then drifted away without explaining why Stephanie was using Wilhelmina's name. Scott smiled. He didn't much care whether the injury and the name substitution were entirely true. The important thing was that Professor Dumbledore knew. He felt a little relief at that, and left the library with a lighter step. 323. A request I can't refuse. As Christmas drew near, Hogwarts took on a festive air, and the students grew generally happier. Hermione was an obvious exception. Over the past few days, Scott had run into her several times, and each time she looked grim, so much so that she hadn't even been eating with Harry and Ron. Scott suspected his offhand suggestion to rescue Buckbeak had done serious damage to the little McGonagall's nerves. Harry and Ron didn't look very pleased either. It seemed they still hadn't managed to win Hermione over. Then, one afternoon, Hermione sought Scott out. She approached him with an uncharacteristically sharp expression and asked directly, "Do you think I should do it?" Scott had just left arithmancy. Students nearby turned to look when Hermione spoke. "Come with me," he said instead of answering. He led her away from the corridor into a quieter spot. Hermione, who had followed him, looked uncomfortable in a way Scott didn't bother with. He cut straight to the point. "Are you asking for advice?" Hermione glared. "Those two idiots, Harry and Ron, don't understand how serious this is. They think I'm cold-hearted, and it's all because of you." Her eyes shone red for a moment, and she looked down quickly, as if something Ron had said had upset her. Scott let her rant. When she finished, he asked bluntly, "So have you decided?" "I don't know." Hermione sounded torn. "Buckbeak is innocent. Of course I don't want him to die, but—" She looked up, fury and anguish in her face. "Am I supposed to betray Professor McGonagall's trust, break school rules, commit a crime because of this?" "I'm sorry," Scott offered a small smile, "but I can't decide that for you." Hermione's frown deepened. "Oh, you can't decide for me, but you've caused me a lot of trouble." "Sorry," Scott said again with little conviction. Hermione's anger flared at his tone. "It's all because of you." She stopped for a moment, so angry she seemed unable to speak. Scott tried to be helpful anyway. "Listen, it's really a choice between two things," Hermione sneered. "Then please enlighten me, Mr. Trollope." Scott shrugged. "Either you obey the law and the school's authority more, or you save Buckbeak. That's the choice." She rolled her eyes at the oversimplification. Scott continued, ignoring her expression. "If you weren't inclined to save Buckbeak, you wouldn't be torn." Hermione pressed her lips together. Scott added, "Of course, if you can think of a better option." "Enough. Thank you for your counsel." Hermione snapped through clenched teeth and stalked off. Scott watched her go and let out a quiet sigh. "I really shouldn't have said so much." The next day, his regret deepened. At lunch, Harry and Ron cornered him and pressed him to take part in the Buckbeak rescue. If it had been just those two, Scott would have refused, but the Weasley twins were with them. "You can't say no," Fred told him. "Last year, you asked us to help find the Slytherin heir, and we came straight away," George added. "Right," Harry said quickly. "You also told Dumbledore I could hear the monster." Scott ignored Harry and turned to the twins. "That saved your sister," he reminded them flatly. Ron visibly flinched, but Fred and George just grinned. "Sure," Fred said. "Still doesn't mean we're not good friends," George nodded. "You asked, and we agreed. That proves it." Scott rubbed his temples. "Why are Fred and George involved?" "Oh," Harry blushed. "They overheard us in the common room last night." "We were asleep," Ron complained, face scrunched. Scott was not surprised. "Right, you three are always loudly conspiring," he said. Harry and Ron shifted uneasily while the twins preened. Scott considered a moment and then asked, "So you all know what Hermione has?" All four nodded, eyes wide. "It's amazing," Fred said. "I can't believe we missed out because we didn't take all the classes." "Percy never told us about it either," George added. "He probably has one too." He jabbed a thumb at Ron. "Forget Percy. Bill didn't tell us either." Scott cut to the chase. "What's the plan?" Fred and George exchanged delighted grins. "Simple. they said in unison. Watch the execution openly. Then go back in time. Secretly rescue Buckbeak. Scott raised an eyebrow. That's it? Rescue a hippogriff in broad daylight? Even if you succeed, how will you avoid the ministry afterward? Buckbeak can fly, Harry said, and I have an invisibility cloak. So you really don't need that many people. Fewer is better, Scott remarked. Of course Hermione and I will do it, Harry said. You lot stand in the crowd and act whenever you need to. Be our backup. Scott finally nodded. If that's all, I can agree. He hesitated momentarily and then added, though your plan needs more work. 324. Before the execution begins. The day before the Christmas holiday arrived fast, and it was also the day of the execution. After lunch, Harry found Scott again to talk. Hagrid wrote to me, Scott said, holding out a piece of paper. The handwriting was blurred and streaked with tears. The Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures say they intend to execute Buckbeak at sunset. There's nothing you can do to stop it, so don't come. I don't want you to see such a cruel thing. It's time to act, Scott said, winking at Eddie beside him. Leave it to me. Eddie smiled confidently and then turned away. Scott told Harry, once Eddie spreads this through Slytherin, it's up to you. Provoke Malfoy like we planned, so he'll have no choice but to come to the execution. No problem, Harry said with a smile. I'm good at that. I thought so, Scott said, smiling too. After Harry left, Roger looked at Scott with interest. Are you really going to get involved in this, even letting Eddie help? Don't worry, I'm only talking, Scott said. Dumbledore will be there. Roger immediately caught his meaning and patted his shoulder. Just like you, always cunning. He lowered his voice. Even if you promised, with Dumbledore there you won't have to interfere yourself. Scott smiled but said nothing. That was the plan. Offer ideas, watch, but not be directly involved. With Dumbledore present, he needn't worry about Harry and Hermione, who would be doing the acting. After afternoon classes, Scott and his roommates left the castle together and headed for Hagrid's hut at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Are you all right? Scott asked Milton, who looked pale. Milton pressed his lips together and shook his head. He'd chosen to witness the execution himself, so Scott didn't push further. They reached the edge of the forest and saw 3 distinct groups gathered a short distance from Hagrid's hut. The first group was Harry, Ron, Hermione, the Weasley twins, Neville, and several other Gryffindors, facing a cluster of Slytherins led by Malfoy. A second group, mostly Hufflepuffs who'd come after Eddie spread the news, stood nearby, eager for the spectacle. Scott and his friends joined a third group and watched the verbal sparring between Harry and Malfoy from up close. I didn't expect you to be kind enough to bring this to my attention, Malfoy sneered, chin high, letting me enjoy the fruits of victory. You're wrong, Harry shot back. I just want you to see what you've done. I want you to see the blood with your own eyes. An innocent creature will be brutally killed because of what you and people like you have done. Malfoy's face went a little pale at that, but he still curled his lip. Don't be ridiculous, Potter. I can't wait to see that beast executed. His words were packed with malice. Not only that, he added, I want to see you in that great oaf, bawling your eyes out. Harry looked truly furious, fists clenched, glaring at Malfoy. Malfoy was about to speak when the door of Hagrid's hut opened. Dumbledore and Fudge came out first, followed by 2 unfamiliar wizards. One looked extraordinarily old, gnarled like a withered tree. The other was tall, with a sparse black mustache and a gleaming axe in his hand. They're from the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures, Malfoy announced smugly. See the executioner with the axe? That's Walden McNair, an old friend of my father's. Oh, of course, a bloody executioner, Harry said with a sneer. He's just your sort of friend. How dare you, Malfoy growled, bristling as if ready to leap at Harry. Tension crackled between them, but as Dumbledore and Fudge approached, the 2 committee men steadied the situation and pulled them back. Why are there so many students? Fudge said to Dumbledore, sounding annoyed. This won't do. Children shouldn't see this. There's nothing wrong with it, Minister, Fred said boldly. It's not about being scared, Fudge replied, moving closer to the group. Malfoy stepped forward and greeted the minister with exaggerated respect. Good afternoon, Minister. Good afternoon, Mr. Malfoy. At the sight of Malfoy, Fudge's smile widened. But before Malfoy could say anything further, Fudge turned to Harry. "Oh, and how are you, Harry? I didn't expect you here." Malfoy's expression soured at that. "Good afternoon, Minister," Harry said politely. "Quickly take your friends back, Harry," Fudge said. "This isn't suitable for you children." By the way he said it, he clearly lumped Malfoy in with Harry's friends, which made Malfoy look even angrier. "We only want to see Buckbeak off," Harry said quickly, pleading. "Please." Fudge glanced to Dumbledore, hesitating a moment. "Albus, what do you think?" Dumbledore, who had been silent until then, looked out over the students. His presence carried more authority here than the minister's, and everyone fell quiet. "Stand a little further back," he said gently. "We won't let you see anything unpleasant." Fudge nodded, and the students began to retreat a few steps under Dumbledore's direction. Just then the executioner with the axe shouted toward the hut. "The time has come! Bring out that mad beast, Hagrid!" "I'll feed him well," Hagrid's booming voice answered from inside. "I'll feed him proper." "Now," the executioner called again. After a short while, Hagrid finally led Buckbeak out of the hut. He looked worn and haggard, gently stroking the feathers along Buckbeak's neck. "I'm here," he whispered, voice rough. "We're here." 3:25. Watching a rescue, under everyone's eyes, Hagrid led Buckbeak with heavy, reluctant steps to the edge of the vegetable patch. The students stood back and watched. Hagrid glanced at Harry for a few seconds, opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it again. At that moment, the executioner, McNair, came up. He roughly ripped the rope from Hagrid's hand, tied one end to a large tree at the edge of the patch, and blindfolded the hippogriff with a black cloth. "You should have used a chain, Hagrid," McNair said with a sneer. "This rope might not hold this mad beast." "What did you say?" Hagrid stepped forward, glaring. "Buckbeak isn't mad." Faced with Hagrid's huge, threatening figure, McNair took an involuntary step back. His smile turned ugly. "Are you going to resist, Hagrid?" he said, provoking. "I must remind you, this is the result of the Wizengamot's judgment. If you resist, you'll be heading for Azkaban, too." "I'm not trying to resist, but don't you dare insult Buckbeak in front of me." Hagrid growled, planting himself between McNair and the hippogriff. Watching from a distance, Scott raised an eyebrow. Concentrating his magic sense, he picked up something strange. 2 extremely faint magical signatures beneath Buckbeak. Harry and Hermione had returned from the future by Time Turner and were cloaked under an invisibility cloak. The cloak's shielding was so powerful that ordinary sight could not detect it. Even Scott could only detect the faintest traces by focusing intently on where Buckbeak stood. He realized in an instant that Hagrid's blocking wasn't intended to stop the execution, so much as to give cover to whoever was hidden there. Beside Hagrid, an elderly member of the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures muttered with a tremor in his voice. "Oh, I've said it before. I can't do this. I'm too old." Dumbledore and Minister Fudge arrived then. "Since the time is up, let's begin at once," Fudge said to McNair warningly. McNair snapped. "Of course, Minister. Hagrid's obstructing the execution." Fudge glanced at Dumbledore rather than answering Hagrid. Dumbledore sighed. "Move aside, Hagrid." Hagrid whimpered, hesitated for a few seconds, then stepped back. "Then let's begin." McNair picked up his axe and approached Buckbeak. The nervous hippogriff growled and began to struggle, testing the ropes as if trying to break free. Dumbledore and Fudge shifted to block the student's view. Apart from Scott, no one could see more than the raised axe in McNair's hand. "Oh, my goodness," came the murmurs from the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. "Oh, you beast!" McNair cried out and fell. Before he could scramble up, Buckbeak had broken free and taken to the air. The blindfold had fallen off. "Stop it!" McNair roared, but by the time Fudge could draw his wand, Buckbeak was already climbing higher and higher, vanishing toward the Forbidden Forest. Dumbledore, with a slow, rueful movement in near-perfect time with the trembling old committee member, drew his wand and said, "Oh, I apologize. I'm too old. My reflexes aren't what they were." "Escaped? What happened?" The students were bewildered. Scott pushed through and said to Harry, "Come on, let's go look." They had to show themselves now. Harry nodded and led the students to the edge of the patch to see for themselves. McNair hauled himself up from the ground, glaring at Hagrid. Blood darkened one of his arms. The axe lay on the ground. "You damned man, what did you do?" he spat. "You didn't watch him properly." Hagrid shot back. You deliberately used a weak rope, didn't you? McNair yelled, trying to pin the blame on Hagrid. No, you inspected it, Hagrid retorted. Their argument grew louder while the rest watched in confusion. Fudge, however, looked uneasy. He glanced at Dumbledore more than once, but the headmaster's performance of bafflement was flawless. Probably only Dumbledore and Scott truly understood what had happened. Earlier, the Harry and Hermione who had come back from the future had climbed onto Buckbeak's back, while Hagrid kept McNair talking. Because Harry's scent was familiar, the hippogriff had not panicked. Harry tore the blindfold and held the cloth so it wouldn't drop, while Hermione worked at the ropes until they were mostly cut through. When McNair drew near again, the struggling Buckbeak easily broke its restraints. Once it could see the raised axe, it lashed out in desperation, injuring McNair's arm, and then took off with Harry and Hermione still on its back. McNair accused Hagrid loudly. "Minister Fudge," he cried. "It must have been him. Arrest him." "Calm down, McNair," Fudge soothed, then conferred with Dumbledore. Though he didn't believe Hagrid had tampered with anything right before him, he clearly suspected someone at Hogwarts had interfered. "Oh, none of our teachers or students would do such a thing," Dumbledore said, shaking his head. "No one else came near here just now, and the number of students has not decreased." He turned to Draco Malfoy. "What do you say, Mr. Malfoy?" Malfoy looked around with a sullen face, but could find no one missing, so he could only nod. Dumbledore addressed the trembling old committee member. "This was just an accident. Perhaps you can track it. It is likely hiding in the Forbidden Forest." "Oh, I've said I couldn't do this. I'm too old, too old." The man kept muttering. 326. Christmas in 1993. "Oh, you actually got involved in this kind of thing?" That night in the Room of Requirement, after Scott finished telling his story, the portrait of Rowena Ravenclaw watched him with the faintest hint of amusement. Saving a magical creature, she remarked, wasn't something she'd expected him to do. "It's good to stir things up once in a while," Scott replied with a smile, and then recounted his conversation with Dumbledore. "So you did it on purpose," the portrait teased. "That was part of it," Scott admitted. "The other part was curiosity about the invisibility cloak, one of the so-called Deathly Hallows, and about the time turner." Ravenclaw tilted her head. "If that was your aim, why didn't you take all the courses back then? You'd have had a better chance of getting a time turner." "There was no need," Scott said. "I didn't want to waste time and energy on things I wouldn't use or didn't care about." Ravenclaw nodded. "So what did you learn?" Scott shook his head. "Time is too mysterious. Even seeing two Harrys and two Hermiones at once, I couldn't sense anything. And the invisibility cloak. Yes, it's far more powerful than an ordinary cloak, but it still can't completely block my magical perception." "Your sensitivity to magic is rare in this world," Ravenclaw observed. "It explains your strong perception." Scott leaned forward. "About the Deathly Hallows, the cloak, the Resurrection Stone, the Elder Wand, do you know anything about them?" Ravenclaw smiled softly, not answering directly. "Do you think death truly exists?" He thought for a moment. "I don't know. Even if death exists, I don't think he's a god, maybe just an extraordinarily powerful wizard." "An interesting way to think of it," she said. "You can regard the so-called Hallows as powerful alchemical objects." Scott picked up the implication. Can regard suggested there might be more to it, but he didn't press. If Ravenclaw knew something she hadn't told him, she would have spoken freely. Her vagueness meant this was not for him to know yet. "Though you are curious," the portrait added, "remember this, do not meddle with time." Scott left the Room of Requirement, taking the warning seriously. The next day, he and his roommates boarded the express train out of Hogwarts, and that afternoon, he flew alone to Madrid. Ramiro met him at Barajas with an enormous hug. "My dear little cousin, another magical semester done." Scott grinned and shrugged off the curious looks around them. At home, Amelia fell upon him with a warm embrace. "Long time no see, my son. Every term you finish makes me breathe easier," she said. "Hogwarts isn't as frightening as you think, Mum," he answered. "Mealy worries too much about you," Michael added, "and you forbid us from sending owls." "Sorry, Father." Scott felt a little helpless. He couldn't allow owls to find their house after shielding his name when he left England. Michael and Amelia weren't wizards, so regular owls couldn't find them anyway. Only Shay, who knew the place, could find the way back. Scott spent a pleasant, quiet Christmas with his family. Because of the name shield, owls couldn't deliver gifts to him, so he only received presents from his parents and relatives. He had, however, placed orders and sent money before the holidays so shops could deliver gifts to his professors and friends. On the first day after Christmas, his phone buzzed. It was Lambo. "You okay, Scott? Things are getting stranger and stranger," his friend said, voice tight. "What's happened?" Scott asked. Lambo's news was blunt. The Yaxley, Bulstrode, and Foley families have reconciled. Scott was baffled. "What?" "Yes, reconciled." Lambo sounded incredulous himself. "They've divided the Travers legacy quickly, and the ministry and the other families didn't even react." "How did that happen?" Scott asked. "The Green Robbers got involved," Lambo replied. "Medea?" Scott's tongue clicked. "You weren't discovered by her?" "Luckily, that woman didn't show up," Lambo said, still sounding a touch unnerved. But with the Green Robbers interfering, the three families redistributed the benefits and made peace. Lambo explained what he knew. The Foley boy ultimately took the Travers name and is engaged to the Bulstrode girl. The Bulstrode and Yaxley families received property endowments as part of the settlement. Scott felt a sting of irritation. His revenge against the Yaxleys hadn't produced the result he'd wanted. He had eliminated the heir they'd put forward, causing them to miss out on the Travers inheritance. But in the end, the families patched things up, and the losses were smoothed over. Medea's involvement made the outcome even more unpredictable. He let out a slow breath and set the matter aside for the moment, then asked about Caro and Roll. "They didn't come back to Britain for Christmas," Lambo reported. Scott frowned. He hadn't expected that front to go cold either. "Wait for me," he told Lambo. "We'll talk more tomorrow. I'll be back at Oak Cottage then." 327. A gift for Carlo. The day after Lambo's call, Scott said goodbye to his parents and relatives and used a port key, a silver, snake-shaped necklace, to arrive at the Raven territory. He was much more practiced with spatial travel now. He still staggered a few steps when he landed, but at least he wasn't thrown to the ground like last time. The crows in the surrounding oaks cawed loudly at his arrival, and soon Lambo flew down from the largest tree. "Scott, you're here," it squawked happily, landing on his shoulder. "Come on up." Scott took out his flying broom, climbed on, and rode into the sky. As he approached, the Oak Cottage, the house hidden by the Fidelius charm, unfolded like a piece of folded paper, revealing itself. Scott landed the broom in front of the cottage, leaned it against the wooden wall, and pushed open the door. He hadn't been here for a semester. A thin layer of dust covered the floor and furniture. "A bit messy, but nothing terrible," Lambo shrugged. "I can't do the cleaning for you." "It's fine." Scott activated the severed arm bone, then drew his wand and ran a few household spells. In moments, the wooden cottage was neat and clean again. He sat at the small desk. Lambo hopped up and looked at him. "Let's not waste time. What are you planning to do about Caro and the Roar family?" it asked. Scott paused before answering. "Want to go to Durmstrang?" Lambo suggested. "It's way up on the Scandinavian peninsula, isolated. Even if you got there, you'd never get into the castle." Scott laughed. "No thanks. I'm too lazy." "So what then?" Lambo asked, genuinely curious. It hadn't considered Scott would give up on getting back at his enemies. Obviously, Scott couldn't just let it go. Scott tapped the desk. "I thought about finding something Caro really loves and giving it to him, something tailored to his tastes. But honestly, what could he like more than his cousin Roll?" "Don't brag," Lambo said flatly. "Can you really give him Roll?" Scott smiled, didn't answer, and pulled a shifting lizard skin satchel from his waist. He took out a set of paints and brushes. "Sometimes a little artistic skill comes in handy," he said. "Oh, a portrait?" Lambo guessed. "Aren't you worried someone will recognize your style?" "Who said my paintings only have one style?" Scott replied confidently. "And under what name will you present it?" Lambo pressed. "You'll see," Scott said. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a heart-shaped pendant necklace. He opened it, took out a magnifying glass, and picked the smallest brush, beginning to paint on the miniature paper set into the pendant. It took him 2 days of careful work. The next morning, Lambo gaped. "She's moving!" Inside the tiny heart-shaped frame, Scott had created a lifelike miniature of Caitlin Roll. Whenever the pendant was opened, the girl in the painting wore a gentle, faint smile that looped over and over, exactly the image of Roll Caro would dream of. To avoid revealing his own style, Scott painted in an utterly realistic manner, trying to match a photograph. He hadn't studied magical painting, so he used animation principles and transfiguration to make the image move. He painted dozens of slightly different frames to create the short looping motion. Magic handled the parts where he could be lazy. The hardest part, Scott thought, wasn't the painting, but hiding the rune circuit he'd woven into the picture. "How is it?" he asked Lambo. Lambo nodded again and again. "He'll definitely like it." "Now to activate the rune," Scott said, shutting the pendant and closing his eyes. He concentrated on the thought he wanted to plant in Caro's mind. Caitlin Roll belongs to Elijah Caro forever. If she tries to escape, let death seal their true love. Magic flowed from Scott's hand into the pendant. The rune circuit hidden beneath the miniature glowed faintly, then faded. Next, he wrote a letter. He made it look as though a girl had penned it, the handwriting rendered in a printed font by charm. "Elijah Caro, I hope you manage your fiancée. Miss Travers was a wonderful friend to us all, a remarkable girl, and she is deceased." She did not own Caitlin Roll. "This pendant was a gift Miss Travers once gave to a friend, and we have decided to hand it over to you to deal with as you see fit. Please do your best to make your fiancée understand that her duty is to marry you, not to behave like a so-called obsessive friend. Her conduct is tarnishing Miss Travers's reputation and damaging the honor of the Caro and Roar families." Friends of Miss Travers, Lambo, read the letter and let out a long, disbelieving noise. "Aren't you worried Caro will be furious when he sees this and smash the pendant? Or give it to Roll?" "I don't think so," Scott said, opening the pendant just enough to show the image. "Once he sees it." Lambo didn't understand what being a simp meant, or how far someone could be driven. Scott folded the letter, slipped it and the pendant into a sturdy parchment envelope, and scribed Elijah Caro's name on the outside with a spell. "Now to send it," he said, smiling. As long as Caro looked at the portrait in the pendant every day, the hidden rune would influence him, and the thought would sink deeper and deeper into his mind. Scott imagined the drama that would follow, the devoted admirer turning dark. He would probably never get to see it in person, but the thought of it thrilled him nonetheless. "Let's go. We're heading to London." Scott got up and left, using an engorgement charm to make Lambo large enough to ride. After arriving in London, he changed his appearance with Polyjuice Potion and mailed his letter from the Owl Post in Diagon Alley. Learning from his last mistake, he didn't use Roger's identity this time. He took a hair from a passerby instead. Once the letter was sent, Scott slipped out of Diagon Alley, took the Underground to Charing Cross, then a train to Hastings. Christmas break still had a few days, and he planned to spend them at home. Hastings was small, and on his way back, Scott ran into plenty of acquaintances. He reluctantly repeated the same explanation about Michael and Amelia leaving, this time saying they'd gone to North America and he'd come back to check on the house. After some delay on the road, he finally reached his doorstep. The garden had been neglected for a year and was almost completely overgrown. It was winter. Plants grew haphazardly, and the place looked gloomy. He stepped through the yard and opened the front door. Inside, furniture was draped in white sheets, and a thick layer of dust covered the floor. Lambo, who had been quiet until then, couldn't help himself. "So this is your home? It's big, but it's a bit of a mess." Scott rolled up his sleeves and started cleaning. With magic, it didn't take long. Soon the house looked as it should. After a quick dinner out, he removed the charm that had been hiding his name. The next morning, he opened the door to find the doorway piled high with parcels and several owls descending from the sky, each clutching a gift. Scott smiled and hauled the packages into his room. As in previous years, most of the presents were books, and there were plenty of duplicates. Gifts from professors were more notes or books. "At this rate, you could open a bookstore," Lambo said. Scott shrugged and sorted the books on the shelf by category. He moved on to the other presents from friends. Eddie had sent a valuable fountain pen. Roger had included a few game discs. Milton's gift was a book of famous paintings from around the world. Harry had sent a bag of candy, and as usual, Scott had sent him candy in return. Ron's contribution was a greeting card. Hermione had sent a postcard. Luna's present arrived in a large box. When Scott opened it, he found an animal horn. A crumple-horned snorkack horn, he wondered, then read Luna's note. He frowned. This is clearly a horned serpent horn. The horn was dangerous. A horned serpent's horn could pierce anything and contained a lethal liquid that made whatever it injected explode. Still, it would make a formidable weapon. Scott closed the box with a helpless smile and tucked it into his deformation lizard skin bag. Next, he noticed a wooden box beside it, black with green leaf patterns. He removed the envelope and read the note. Savannah. He remembered the arithmancy reading he'd given her and that she was probably taking druid trials. Savannah's letter didn't say much, just a Merry Christmas. Curious, Scott opened the box. Inside lay a necklace of leather cord threaded with wooden beads, animal teeth, and feathers, very similar to one Savannah had once shown him that had belonged to her brother. He picked it up and, finding nothing obvious, tentatively fed a little magic into it. Immediately he regretted it. The room spun, and the necklace had activated a portkey. He cursed under his breath. He'd been careless. Because he'd been able to confirm the letter was from Savannah, he hadn't suspected, and now he was being pulled somewhere. The spatial jump ended abruptly and hard. Unprepared, Scott landed heavily. "What's going on?" Lambeau shouted. He'd come along at the last moment, grabbing the necklace in Scott's hand with his claws and getting dragged through the portkey too. Scott found himself in pitch black. The smooth stone beneath him and the gaps between flagstones told him this place was man-made. He scrambled to his feet and drew his wand. He wasn't panicked. A portkey was usually a one-way ticket back, which gave him some confidence. Lambeau flew to perch on his shoulder. "Let's get out of here fast! No need to rush!" Scott activated the severed arm bone he kept as a focus and cast Lumos to light the space. He looked around and saw they were in an almost completely sealed stone chamber. Slabs of smooth stone forming floor, ceiling, and all the walls, nothing else. Scott walked the chamber, running his hand along every slab. They were all smooth, no inscriptions, no seams he could find. He carefully stowed the necklace that had brought him here, then glanced at the silver snake-shaped chain wrapped around his left wrist, but didn't rush to leave. He felt a faint air current in the otherwise closed room. Extending his magical perception, he detected a weak fluctuation in one section of the wall. "What is it?" Lambeau asked. "Magic," Scott said. "But not a wizard's, not a magical object either." He pressed his wand to his temple and cast super perception. The charm sharpened his awareness. The fluctuation was strange. "Not a creature," he murmured. "It feels like a plant." He backed away to another wall, turned off Lumos, and readied a different spell. "Deprimo, Protego," he called reflexively as well, and then a counter-charm flashed into being. The Deprimo strike hit the opposite wall, and the impact exploded outward. Stone slabs were blown open, and debris flew, but Scott's Protego flared and caught the fragments. He relit Lumos and peered through the dust at the opening in the wall. The light on Scott's charm flared again. Through it he saw the hole blasted in the opposite wall. Lambeau peered at it and asked, "Can we get out now?" "Who knows?" Scott stepped forward slowly and stood at the entrance with his charm raised. Beyond lay a deep, dark tunnel, choked with thick, twisted tree roots. The magical disturbances he'd felt earlier seemed to be coming from those roots. He didn't rush in. Instead, he flicked his charm once more. Flock of birds. Unpleasant caws filled the air as a flock of black crows erupted from the tip of his charm and scattered into the passage. "Let them scout ahead," Scott told Lambeau. The goat cawed a few times in reply. The crows quieted at the sound of Lambeau's voice and flew down the tunnel. Scott took a few more steps back, used a moving charm to pile the blasted stones against the wall, and then cast a transfiguration. Under the soft light of the transfiguration, the stones reassembled into the shape of a giant wolf. The stone wolf stood, its body shifting into flesh and fur. At Scott's command, the gray wolf padded into the root-choked passage at a steady pace. After it had gone some distance, Scott checked his pocket watch and followed. "Was that gift from the girl who can turn into a wolf?" Lambeau asked from the silent tunnel. "Why would she do that?" Would I know? Scott snapped. The roots were so thick, the path was hard to navigate. He had to scramble with hands and feet. I thought you'd have some ideas, Lambo pressed. Not a clue, Scott said. Then why don't you just leave? Lambo suggested. Because we came here to find out who brought me and why, Scott replied. If he couldn't figure out the setup, he would never take the initiative. He kept following the gray wolf. The bird flock had not returned. The wolf didn't stop. The tunnel seemed endless. We went in at 10:16 a.m., Scott said, checking the watch again. It's 11:23 now, almost an hour, and still no exit. He calculated roughly from the crow's speed and frowned. If the crows hadn't come back yet, the passage had to be astonishingly long. Looking up, he wondered where so many roots came from. Was there a dense forest above? He called the wolf back, cast a shield charm, and raised his charm toward the roots hanging from the tunnel ceiling. De primo, he barked. Confringo. Two powerful spells detonated the passage. Dust and debris rained down, and when it settled, Scott saw light filtering from above. He hadn't expected the ceiling to give so easily. I should have known not to walk so far, Lambo muttered, Scott's thought aloud. Scott climbed to the collapse and looked up. Above them was indeed a dense forest. He waved his charm and reshaped the broken stones and roots into a staircase. He sent the gray wolf up first. Only after the wolf reached the forest floor did Scott begin to climb. On the surface, the trees were all the same kind, oaks spreading so densely that it felt like an endless sea of trunks. Can ordinary oaks grow like this? Lambo asked. Ordinary oaks don't hum with magic either, Scott said, his expression darkening. He could feel the subtle, persistent magic in each tree. Alone, none held much, but together they formed a vast, coherent field of power. Which way should we go? Lambo fluttered up. I'll scout from above. Wait, Scott stopped him. Something about the place felt wrong. He waved his charm. The staircase stones scattered. He then changed the largest slab into a giant eagle. The stone eagle spread its wings and shot out of the tunnel, aiming to break through the tree canopy. Just as it was about to breach the treetops, branches lunged like living fingers. Thick limbs shot out and coiled around the eagle like a net. Under their strangling grip, the eagle reverted to stone and fell, thudding to the ground. The gray wolf whined at the noise. Seems we can't get out through the air, Scott said. I could fly out before they reacted, Lambo protested. Not worth the risk, Scott replied. We're not trying to escape. We're here to find out what's going on. He picked a direction and sent the wolf ahead, trailing it at a short distance. As long as they kept to the ground, the oaks remained eerily quiet. Hours passed. Scott spread his magical senses as far as he could, but he couldn't find an edge to the forest. Visually and magically, the dense oak sea had no end. I can't stand this, Lambo complained. Even if I like living in forests, I can't stand this one. We can leave any time, Scott said to soothe it. Then let's go quick, Lambo insisted, or let me fly up and see. No, Scott said. He shook his head and kept walking. We'll make a breakthrough soon. Fine, but we can only stay another hour, Lambo grumbled. Okay, Scott agreed. Then a flapping sound echoed through the trees. Caw! Black shapes appeared in the distance. The flock of crows was back. The crows are here, Lambo cried, suddenly excited. Scott watched the black flock cut a line through the dense forest. How had they emerged from the underground passage? Had they found the passage exit or the opening he'd blasted? A dense black flock of crows cut through the gloom of the oaks and settled on branches a short distance ahead of Scott and Lambo. The trees themselves stood motionless while the birds cawed loudly. After listening for a moment, Lambo told Scott, "They say they saw us the instant they flew out of the passage." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Let's go to wherever they came out." Lambo nodded, let out a few sharp caws, and the flock rose to follow the path they'd come. Scott left the gray wolf where it was, and with Lambo perched on his shoulder, followed the crows at a cautious distance. It didn't take long before the birds dropped again, settling on nearby branches. Scott hurried to where they'd landed, but found no trace of an entrance to any underground passage. "Now, even the crows don't know where they came out," Lambo muttered. Scott closed his eyes and used his magic perception, sweeping the area carefully. Nothing. He searched on foot and still found nothing. "Let's go back," he said and began to turn. A wolf howl carried from another direction. Scott's expression changed. Why did the gray wolf run that way? Lambo asked. It didn't, Scott replied. It won't move without my command. We've lost our way. How's that possible? We didn't go that far. Lambo flew up, peering left and right. Scott pivoted, heading toward the direction of the gray wolf's call. Whether I can explain how or not, the crow's sudden appearance was meant to throw us off. You always make it sound so deliberate, Lambo grumbled. Scott didn't respond directly. Wait and see. Let the crows lead us for now. Back where the wolf had been standing, Scott called it to resume the original line. Wait, Lambo protested. How do you know that direction is correct? Maybe we were already lost. Scott smiled faintly. That's exactly why I'm more confident now. Whoever is behind this wanted us to be misled. They only interfered because we were getting close to something, and they wanted to misdirect us. You make it sound like a plot, Lambo said, uncertain. Keep going, Scott said. To be safe, have the crows fly in a single file, about a meter apart, and stay in front of us. We can use them to draw a straight line. That's hard. There are too many trees, Lambo warned. The oaks were thick. A tight single-file flight would force constant turns, which could break bearings. When the lead crow goes around an obstacle, the others stop and then follow after confirming direction with each other, Scott explained. It's a pain, but it might be the only way. Lambo called to the flock. They obeyed, falling into a deliberate, slow line. Because they paused to realign after every obstacle, their progress was agonizingly slow, but Scott didn't mind. He had the gray wolf come forward and mounted its back. Rest up, save your energy, he told the beast. He hadn't time to relax. Ahead, the bird's raucous cawing rose again. Lambo's voice trembled with excitement. The lead crow sees something. There's a giant oak and some human-made structures. That oak is several times bigger than the one we nested in. Scott studied the line ahead. Crows, hold formation and land. We'll walk along your line. The flock obeyed and dropped to the ground in a neat row. The forest thickened as they followed the bird's trail. Without that line, they would easily have become disoriented. The gray wolf threaded between trunks until finally it brought Scott to the front of the crow's formation. Ahead, the oak wood thinned, then opened on a single massive tree that dominated the clearing like a castle. Around its roots lay huge stones and crude structures built from megaliths. Stonehenge? Scott breathed. From a distance, the scattered monoliths looked uncannily like Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain. He hesitated, reluctant to send the wolf forward. What's the matter? Lambo asked. Scott frowned. My eyes see this, but my magic perception still registers nothing except endless oaks. No giant tree, no stones. What? Lambo chirped. So, should you trust your sight or your perception? Lambo's answer died midway. I don't know. Let the crows check. Scott nodded. Lambo cawed, and the flock dropped from the trees to swarm into the circle of stones. They landed on the megaliths and cawed back. They say the stones are real, Lambo exclaimed, then hovered, waiting for further instructions. Have them go to the center and investigate the structure by the roots, Scott said. Lambo went back to the shoulder, called the flock upward, and they dove into the root structure, threading among the rocks. They emerged seconds later. It's empty inside, Lambo relayed. Only a single stone statue. Scott signaled the gray wolf forward. The animal loped swiftly, and in short order they stood at the edge of the stone circle. Yet in Scott's perception the illusion remained. All he could see through his magic was more oak forest. He dismounted, and the wolf continued on under his command, this time walking calmly toward the tree at the center instead of charging. Worried about traps? Lambo asked. The crows flew in from the air, after all. Scott watched the wolf's path, his eyes narrowing. Then both of them realized something was wrong. The wolf, which Scott's transfiguration had made and should follow commands obediently, began to falter. After passing a few megaliths, it went off course, then more obviously so, weaving as if it could not find the right line. It whined and skittered between stones, frantic, like a headless animal. What's happening? Lambo blurted. Scott took a step back without a word and raised his wand. Confringo, he shouted. A bright charm shot toward the nearest megalith, but the blast never hit. The air over the stone rippled like water and swallowed the light completely. Scott's jaw tightened. He threw up a shield charm, then pointed his wand at the ground. De Primo, he cast, then followed with another Confringo. A massive explosion rocked the clearing. Earth collapsed into a jagged pit. When the dust cleared, Scott peered over the edge. The blasted area was only dirt, no stone, no hidden chamber. He drew the loosened soil toward the hole with a flick and, muttering a water-making charm, tipped water into the pit. Before long, a giant eagle rose from the earth, winging up and passing over Scott's head toward the stone circle. The bird's flight slowed as it passed over the circle. Its wing beats grew labored, then it stalled and fell, slamming into a megalith and simply turning to mud. Lambo crowed triumphantly. "Looks like I still have to step in." Scott shook his head. "It seems only small birds, or creatures without magic, can pass through unhindered." Lambo went quiet. To balance things out, from today onwards, chapters will be 3,000 plus words each. There will still be a guaranteed update of 6,000 plus words daily, just split into 2 chapters. Chapter 331, he hooked up with his sister, but didn't want to take responsibility. "Do you have any other ideas?" Outside Stonehenge, Lambo asked Scott. "Of course, let the ravens lead the way," Scott replied. Lambo pecked him on the shoulder. "Why didn't you say that sooner?" The peck didn't hurt. Scott was wearing a down jacket, so he only smiled. "I wanted to see what wouldn't work here first." Lambo ignored him and flew up, cawing loudly. At his call, the flock of ravens fluttered back. "Have a few ravens bring the gray wolf out and see how it goes," Scott told Lambo. A handful of ravens flew in and successfully pulled the gray wolf out of the stone circle. The creature looked exhausted. It whimpered a few times and then collapsed on the grass, panting. Scott sat down beside it and stroked the warm, fluffy fur at its neck. "Line them up in a straight path from here to the building in the center," he told Lambo. Perching on the wolf's back, Lambo cawed once more, and the ravens arranged themselves into a line leading to the tree-rooted structure at the center of Stonehenge. Scott patted the wolf's head and stood. The gray wolf, at his command, rose and trotted back into the stones. "This time should be smooth," Lambo said. At first it was. The wolf followed the ravens and soon had covered most of the distance toward the root-wrapped building. But as it neared, the roots that clung to the megalith's surface began to writhe like gigantic pythons. The wolf froze, low growls rumbling in his throat. The roots quickened, then shot forward like striking serpents. The wolf tried to turn and flee, but a root lashed out and bound him, dragging him back. He howled, then shattered into scattered stones. The roots settled again, as if nothing had happened. "Oh my goodness. Thankfully you didn't go in yourself," Lambo exclaimed, relieved. Scott watched in silence, breathing out slowly. He'd noticed that the ravens, though startled, hadn't been harmed. The roots hadn't targeted them at all. "This place only targets real, non-magical animals?" Scott mused, glancing at the ravens, which had reformed their line. Lambo fluffed his feathers. "Then I should be able to go in. I'm a real raven, just a bit mutated." Scott shook his head. Lambo had been born through a one-time use of the Philosopher's Stone, which might count as a genuine magical creature, but Scott didn't want to risk it. "That's just a guess. Maybe they only allow ordinary, non-magical animals inside." "So what do we do?" Lambo asked, anxious. "Let's go back." Scott rolled up his sleeve, revealing a silver snake-shaped necklace on his wrist. He looked at the ancient building and said, "I think only a wizard who can become an animal, an animagus, would be able to enter." "Okay." Lambo flew to Scott's hand and clutched the necklace with his claws. "Wait." Just as Scott was about to activate the port key, a shout came from inside the tree-rooted building. Scott looked up. The voice was young and male. "Scott Trollope," it called. "Come over. There will be no more obstacles on your way to the temple." Scott paused. "Aaron Doherty?" he asked, holding his wand to his throat. The voice grew louder. "You know me?" It was the man Scott had guessed. "Of course you know me. You used a port key to bring me here, didn't you?" Scott said. "Savannah Doherty's brother, Aaron Doherty. Was it you?" "That's right. Call me Aaron." The voice was casual. "Do you need something?" "Come over," Aaron invited. "Talk to me in the temple." Scott smiled, but stayed where he was. "Sorry, I don't trust strangers." There was a sharp, incredulous sound. "What? I'm Savannah's brother." "That may be," Scott said evenly, "but a fellow student's brother is still a stranger to me." "Fellow student?" Aaron sounded offended and then angry. "You said Savannah is a student?" "Yes, Savannah Doherty, a Ravenclaw at Hogwarts," Scott replied. A roar cut across the stones. You scoundrel! You messed around with my sister and don't want to take responsibility? She's only 12, the voice bellowed. Scott's mouth twitched. What on earth was this about? Are you mistaken, Mr. Doherty? He asked, interrupting the shouting. Savannah and I have no romantic relationship. Not? Aaron was stunned. You're not Savannah's boyfriend? No, Scott said flatly. For a moment, the tone softened. You're Scott Trollope? I am. Then Aaron's voice grew loud again. Why would you say you weren't? He demanded. Lambo couldn't help himself. He burst out laughing. Ha ha! Scott! When did you get yourself a little girlfriend? He laughed so hard he trembled, apparently forgetting or abandoning the rule about speaking in front of others. Scott turned and glared. Lambo's laughter stopped at once, and he went still, suddenly obedient. Scott addressed the temple again. Whether you believe it or not, I am not Savannah's boyfriend, nor have I ever pursued her. I suggest you talk to your sister and clear this up. She's only 12 after all. Goodbye. Wait. Aaron's voice was clearly flustered now. I haven't finished speaking. Is there anything else? Scott asked politely. A pause, then sheepishness. Well, perhaps I misunderstood. If I did, I apologize. Good. It was a misunderstanding, Scott said, a little irritably. Your sister is just a 12-year-old girl. Are you saying my sister isn't charming? Aaron sounded defensive. Scott raised an eyebrow. What do you think? My take? Don't look at it from a brother's perspective, Scott said. If you'd fancy a 12-year-old, then you're a pervert. I'm not a pervert, Aaron shouted. I don't like 12-year-old girls. I like mature, full-figured women. His declaration echoed through the stones and hung there for a moment. Scott and Lambo burst into uncontrollable laughter. When the laughter finally died down, Aaron sighed. All right, I apologize. I misunderstood. Fine, Scott replied, putting his calm mask back on. If there's nothing else, I'll be going. Goodbye. I said wait. Aaron tried once more. Scott only smiled. Muttering came from inside the temple, loud and clear enough in that strange hollow. If you won't come over, then I'll come to you. A thick root detached from the building and crashed to the ground. It shifted and reshaped itself, forming a large gray wolf. This one was bigger than the wolf they'd made by Transfiguration earlier, almost as tall as Scott when it ran toward him. Scott tightened his grip on his wand and stayed on guard. The wolf stopped a short distance away and sat, looking at him. When it spoke, it was Aaron's voice. Hello, Scott. I'm sorry. I can only meet you in this form. No problem. It looks like your human body is still dormant, Scott said. He already had a sense of Aaron's condition. The portkey that brought you here was made by my order. We also had someone replace the gift Savannah prepared for you with it. The wolf lowered his head. If possible, Aaron said quietly, please help Savannah. Help Savannah. Scott frowned at the unexpected request. What happened? Why do you think I can help? He'd already made it clear he wasn't Savannah's boyfriend, so why did Aaron assume he could do anything? The gray wolf, crouched not far from him, answered in a voice that carried Aaron's consciousness. Savannah has entered the priest's trial. Scott's smile was wry. The druid's priest's trial, the triple death ordeal. The wolf's eyes widened. How did you know? Did Savannah tell you? She didn't tell me anything, Scott said evenly. That's all I know. The wolf's gaze was oddly human. Scott studied it with interest. Savannah once asked me to perform an arithmancy for you. The result was 3. That number described your state then. Asleep in body, half awake in consciousness, but your spirit was very active. Hearing that, the wolf, and Aaron's voice, sounded surprised. It seems your consciousness has awakened at some point, Scott added. That's obvious, Aaron replied. A slow smile crossed Scott's face. If your spirit isn't damaged and your consciousness is awake, why can you only reach me like this? Is something wrong with your body? Now isn't the time to discuss my problems. Aaron sounded anxious. Savannah is likely in danger. Scott, however, remained calm. Does the triple death consist of 3 separate tests, body, spirit, consciousness, and is your current state the result of passing the trial? The wolf nodded. You're right, my trial finished, but in another sense it failed. I see. Scott was straightforward. How long until you fully recover? I don't know, Aaron shook his head, but I can feel I need more time to return to my body. How much more? Scott asked. At least 3 years. Scott's next question was pragmatic. In your family, must everyone take the priest's trial? No, the wolf answered. Then, why should Savannah do it if you've already? They won't wait 3 years, Aaron snapped. They need a qualified priest as soon as possible. Scott frowned. If you want to stop Savannah, it's probably too late. Her trial should already be underway. Do you want me to help her pass it? It's not like that. Savannah's trial hasn't properly begun. There's still time to stop it. Scott shook his head. This is an internal matter for your family and the Druids, and why would they honor any rule about letting her go? I can't get involved. You can, Aaron insisted. You can take Savannah away. Scott's expression changed. Take her away? I know you're not her boyfriend now, but you could become her boyfriend, Aaron blurted. Scott stared. You expect me to marry her on command? If she's engaged, she can renounce the Druid identity. You can take her away and keep her from this. Aaron's voice hardened. There are rules. If you pass the tests laid down long ago, you can take her. You've already passed most of them. Only the last remains. Scott's patience thinned. That's wishful thinking. If they insist on a child going through the trial in 3 years, why would they respect a rule about leaving through engagement, and why should I meddle in someone else's family? Aaron ignored him. His tone became urgent. If you enter the temple, you'll complete the test, and then you can take her away. Sorry, I can't help, Scott said flatly. Are you refusing because she isn't worthy? Aaron snapped. She's a genius. There are plenty of people worthy of me, Scott said, his tone dry. But it's not about worthiness. I won't walk unguarded into your territory on your say-so. The wolf's annoyance showed. I underestimated your caution. It bared white teeth. But you are ideal for this. I won't let you leave. As if on command, Stonehenge's megaliths hummed. A powerful magic fluctuation rolled through the air. The oaks that shaded the circle began to move, their branches like claws, the entire stand of trees lashing towards Scott like a living storm. Hurry, Scott! Lambeau screeched from his shoulder. Scott didn't hesitate. He let Lambeau touch the silver snake necklace he always wore and activated the port key. Protego, he called as 2 arm-thick root branches shot from the wolf's shoulders to seize him. A translucent shield sprang up, and the roots slammed into it with a thunderous crash. Scott used the impact to step back. The root arms recoiled, and the wolf-shaped bundle of roots collapsed back into a real gray wolf. Are you really refusing? Aaron demanded. Not refusing, Scott said, smiling. Just not going to trust you. There's no way to verify anything you said, and far too many holes in your story. It's too late, the wolf whispered. You've been chosen. I thought as much. Scott's hand tightened on the necklace. If you meant to trap me, then fine. I'm out of here. Aaron's voice rose in alarm. If it were an ordinary portkey, your escape would be impossible with that kind of storm. Your portkey, he began, aghast. Scott's activation cut him off. As the world twisted, he heard a woman's shout, Savannah, calling, Stop, Aaron! Don't hurt! A gray wolf cub darted from the temple, and whatever he saw hooked through his navel like a needle of vertigo. The ground slipped away. When motion ceased, Scott and Lambeau were standing in the Raven Territory forest, breathing hard. That was close, Lambeau buzzed, circling. That was insanely dangerous. It was, Scott admitted with a tight smile. You were right. I should have listened. People these days are wicked, Lambeau warned, still trembling. Don't accept letters or gifts from strangers. They're traps. Scott's agreement was automatic. He found himself thinking about the oaks and their strange magic, druids through and through. From now on, he said, I won't accept anything blindly. They made their way back to Hastings by evening. Scott felt drained, physically and mentally. He glanced at the unopened pile of gifts in his room and felt no curiosity left in him. If only he could learn apparition sooner, he thought, easing onto his bed. He'd need rest. 3:33. The Christmas holiday is over. Early the next morning, Scott received a letter from Savannah. After checking the envelope for hexes and jinxes, he transfigured a small monkey to open it from a safe distance. Only when the creature handed him the paper, and Scott was sure there was no trap, did he take it and begin to read. I'm sorry. Half the page was a messy scrawl of apologies. Scott skimmed past the repeated remorse and went straight to the explanations. Savannah no longer hid who she was. She explained everything. The Doherty family lived in Northern Ireland and had kept the old Celtic ways, the Druids, alive through the generations. Their magic, however, had been waning. When Savannah's brother Aaron was born, the family discovered he wasn't especially talented. That became even more obvious after he underwent the awakening and began his transformation into a druid. The elders feared the family's power would fade away, generation by generation. Then Savannah was born. She showed unusually strong talent. She awakened at 5, completed her magical nature transformation at 7, and passed the preliminary trial to become a formal druid by 9. After that, Aaron changed. Jealousy and an unwillingness to accept his sister's rise drove Aaron away. He had once told Savannah he would shoulder all responsibilities so she could grow up happily, but after she succeeded, he stopped being happy for her. Instead, he looked at her with sadness and distaste. He left home, searching ruins of the old druids, then cut off contact entirely. No one knew what he had experienced. Scott quietly smiled, unable to accept that the sister he was meant to protect could be stronger than him. Savannah continued. The Oak Sea was where the Dohertys had cultivated oaks for generations and where the oldest sacred tree stood. Beneath that sacred tree was the temple where druids were promoted to priest. Sometime later, Aaron secretly returned and intruded into the Oak Sea. He attempted to perform the promotion ritual without proper guidance and failed. When Savannah heard the results Scott had calculated with arithmancy, body asleep, mind half awake, spirit active, she understood. His attempt had not fully failed, but unless body, mind, and spirit could be reunited, he could never finish the final step. Savannah and the elders tried to awaken Aaron's consciousness during the 1993 summer break, but they failed. Her grandfather, desperate, paid a terrible price to wake Aaron's consciousness. In doing so, he sacrificed his rank as a druid priest and became an ordinary druid. He then placed his own consciousness and spirit into the sacred tree, hoping the tree's power might help Aaron's elements unite and allow him to return to his body. The handwriting grew shakier after that, ink blotting the page. Savannah admitted she'd told Aaron about Scott. Aaron learned of Scott's talent and hatched a plan, a sacrificial ritual. By sacrificing Scott, Aaron could complete the promotion and become a priest. The method sounded chillingly familiar to Scott, identical in principle to the rite Medea had used. "We never expected he'd come across such a dark ritual while exploring ruins," Savannah wrote. "When he found out you were a genius, he made a plan to get you to the Oak Sea. If you entered the temple, the sacrifice would begin." Lambo, who had been peering over Scott's shoulder, frowned. "Who's helping him? He's just a consciousness. He can't do all this alone." "Keep reading," Scott said. Lambo's eyebrows shot up as he read. "Oh, it's her cousin, her uncle's daughter. She fell in love with Aaron." "You know that's frowned on," Lambo muttered, then corrected himself. "Well, among Muggles at least." Scott only nodded. Blood preservation and inbreeding had long been common in pure-blood lines. The Gaunts were a notorious example. Savannah's cousin, driven by love, had aided Aaron. She had swapped the gift Savannah had prepared for Scott, and Aaron used the opportunity to siphon power from the sacred tree. That theft allowed him to prepare the sacrifice. "You almost fell for it," Lambo crowed. "Lucky you're not her boyfriend, or you'd have walked right into the trap." Scott considered that for a moment. Would he have let his guard down for someone he loved? He doubted it. Still, the thought made him feel oddly grateful for his current single status. Savannah's letter returned to apologies. "I'm sorry," repeated until the page ran out. Scott skimmed the rest. Lambo asked, "Do you think she can go back to Hogwarts?" "No," Scott said. "If she completes the promotion, she'll have to guard the Oak Sea indefinitely. If she fails, it could be worse than Aaron." "How will she make amends to you?" Lambo pressed. "Who knows?" Scott wasn't taking compensation very seriously. Whether he sought revenge would depend on how sincere any recompense was, provided Aaron never crossed his path again. If Aaron appeared, no amount of compensation would stop Scott from taking vengeance. He closed the letter, found the wooden box that had held the necklace that took him to the Oak Sea, and returned it to its place. Lambo snickered. Scott ignored him. For now, he would leave the matter to chance. Afterward, Scott called his parents in Madrid. His mother, Amelia, was surprised he'd come back to Hastings. "I've been cleaning and starting on the garden," Scott told her. Maybe we should hire a real estate agency to help maintain the house, Amelia agreed. We left in a hurry. Don't worry, I'll have your father arrange someone. Don't forget the old house your grandfather left. Scott spent the rest of the day in the basement finding tools, changing into old clothes, and working on the garden. He wanted to create a template that fit the family's tastes, even if they'd eventually hire professionals. The garden was in a sorry state. It took him the whole day to make a dent. It's been a long time since I worked like a muggle, he told Lambo that evening, rubbing his sore shoulders. You could have done it secretly with magic, Lambo said. That would defeat the point, Scott replied with a small smile. I was remembering the days I did chores for pocket money. Lambo didn't understand the nostalgia, but Scott was content. The rest of his holiday passed without incident. When Christmas break was over, he arrived at King's Cross on time and boarded the Hogwarts Express. After they boarded the train, Scott and his 3 roommates squeezed into the same compartment. How was your holiday, everyone? Eddie asked, more as a prompt than a question, and before anyone could answer, he launched into a breathless, overdramatic account of 2 tedious weeks at home. Scott smiled and kept his own story to himself. He was afraid it would sound too wild. Hello, he thought. The compartment door opened and Luna slipped in. What's wrong, Luna? Scott asked, turning. Oh, I wanted to talk to you, she said, taking a seat beside him without ceremony. Savannah wrote to me. Scott nudged Milton, who was by the window, and the 2 of them made room for her. Thanks. Luna glanced around at the other 3 boys, then fixed her silver-gray eyes on Scott. Savannah says she's not coming back to Hogwarts this term, she said. But she didn't say why. Do you know? Before Scott could lie, he knew occlumency wouldn't help here. Luna answered herself, as if sensing the truth. A haze appeared in her eyes, and her voice took on that dreamy, distant quality she often had. Oh, you know. Yes, Scott said softly. Luna held his gaze, waiting. She'll have to face a trial, and she'll change, Scott said. After that, she'll have a duty to fulfill. I see. Luna's eyes cleared and the smoky film faded. She nodded, calm and satisfied. Scott allowed himself a small, amused smile when he noticed the surprised looks on his roommates' faces. How exactly? Eddie blurted, unable to hold back his curiosity. Scott smiled but didn't elaborate. Is Savannah dropping out? Eddie pressed. Are you a friend of Savannah's, Eddie? Luna asked. Eddie hesitated, his lie about to start, but Luna already looked away. You're not, she said, airy and sure. Her words shut him down. She's a VIP customer of mine, Eddie muttered. Luna ignored him. I hope Savannah's journey goes well, she told Scott, then pulled a copy of the Quibbler from her satchel and buried herself in it with delighted little laughs. Scott's roommates watched her with mild bemusement. They were used to Luna's eccentricities, but it still looked odd. Scott accepted it and turned to Milton. Milton had gone back to Graves for Christmas. Reluctantly, his grandfather had insisted he return the day after the holiday, despite Mr. Graves telling him not to. Scott wanted to know if he'd run into trouble. It's nothing really, Milton said. Father said he'd fix things with the family, and he did. He showed no bitterness. If anything, he seemed detached. Whether he told them or not, my grandfather and the rest of them don't acknowledge me anymore. He shrugged. To be honest, it's kind of nice. Being ignored has its peace. Scott patted his shoulder. If they ignore you, why call you back? Probably for appearances, Milton said. Father has a new position, head secretary in the Minister for Magic's office. They're hosting guests to celebrate. Scott's eyebrows twitched. He knew Mr. Graves's current wife, Mrs. Zabini, was connected to Medea. He couldn't help suspecting the appointment had Medea's fingerprints on it. The train began to move. I should do my prefect rounds, Scott said, standing. No one objected. Eddie and Roger fell into a Quidditch discussion. Luna returned to the Quibbler, and Milton gave him a casual smile. Scott left the compartment and started his patrol. He greeted acquaintances, walked slowly car to car. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until he reached the last carriage and heard raised voices. That house elf was insane. It threw a fit and ruined everything at Christmas. Harry's voice carried down the corridor. You were unlucky, mate, Ron replied. I can't believe it, Harry snapped. It actually said I stole Regulus's heirloom. I didn't. Sirius said nothing was missing. That thing's just out to get me because I'm not pure blood. Scott stopped. Regulus Black's heirloom, the locket, was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. If the Black family's house elf was accusing Harry of taking something, the locket was missing. "Oh, don't say that, Harry," Hermione was saying gently. "It didn't steal anything," Harry protested. Sirius said nothing was gone. "Maybe someone broke in and took it?" Scott suggested aloud, and the three of them fell silent. "We're not plotting anything, Scott," Harry said when Scott pushed the compartment door open and walked in. Harry's face was sour. "We're arguing about that crazy house elf at the Black House." "I heard," Scott said. "It accused you of stealing something." Harry looked worse. "Do you think something's really gone?" "Could be," Scott said. "Either someone got in, or the house elf's making it up." "Others shouldn't be able to enter. It's protected," Harry said. "It's probably targeting me." "Protected how? The Fidelius charm?" Scott asked. "I don't know," Harry admitted. "Sirius didn't mention anything like that. If it's the Fidelius, then yes, it's locked down. If not, someone could have got in." "I'll ask Sirius," Harry said, hesitant. Ron shrugged. "Who would break into a house to steal from a house elf? As Harry says, that thing's nuts." "You can't call them things," Hermione snapped. "House elves have been oppressed and abused for ages. They're not monsters." Ron blinked. "Seriously, that house elf called Harry a thief. It's clearly gone mad." "It might be disturbed," Hermione said, "because of how they've been treated." "I'm not defending them," Harry said hotly. "Dobby almost got Ron and me expelled once and broke my arm with a bludger. Now creatures slandering me, and you're defending them?" Scott had had enough of the quarrel. He wasn't interested in the politics of house elf oppression right now. His mind was on the locket. If Regulus's heirloom was truly missing from the Black House, someone had taken a Horcrux. In the originals, the locket had been hidden in a booby-trapped seaside cave, replaced with a fake by Regulus, and the real locket had been entrusted to the house elf with instructions to destroy it, an order the elf could not carry out, but which kept the locket concealed. Who would have gone to the cave, found the fake, and then traced the real one back to the Black House? Medea? Voldemort? Someone else entirely? Scott let the others argue and slipped out of the carriage to think. The key question was whether the house was under a Fidelius charm. In the original timeline, the Fidelius was used later when the Order took up headquarters in the house, but circumstances here were different. If the house was protected by a Fidelius, identifying the thief might be straightforward. If not, tracking whoever had the locket would be far more difficult. The train pulled into Hogsmeade Station. Night had already fallen. On the platform, Eddie said, "We still don't know how we'll get back to the castle. The Thestrals are gone. Who's going to pull our carriages?" "Let's go see." Roger led the way off the platform. They came to the edge and saw the line of carriages, empty at the front. "Oh, have the Thestrals come back?" Eddie dashed to one and reached forward, feeling around. "No, there's nothing there," Luna said. "It looks like the carriages have become self-driving," Scott added with a smile. Curious, the group climbed into a carriage. Not long after every student had boarded, the carriages all moved together, gliding steadily toward Hogwarts. "How are the carriages moving now?" Eddie peered left and right. "Some kind of alchemy? Maybe Dumbledore's using magic," Roger guessed. "Using magic to move so many carriages at once?" Eddie scoffed, then nodding. "If it were Dumbledore, sure, he could do it." Scott laughed. "It's not Dumbledore, it's Professor Flitwick." "Really?" The others looked surprised. Scott closed his eyes for a moment. "I can feel it, Flitwick's handiwork." "Oh, brilliant! Good old Flitwick!" Eddie pumped his fist. Scott expanded his awareness a little and added, "It's not just Flitwick. Almost all the professors are involved." "Is that so?" Eddie's excitement cooled. Roger said, "That's only a stopgap. They should bring the Thestrals back as soon as possible." "The Thestrals will come back," Luna said, certain. Scott glanced at her. Luna smiled. "When the Ministry changes minister, the Thestral herd will return to Hogwarts." She spoke as if convinced by Professor Trelawney's prophecy and her own interpretation. "Why do you say that?" Milton asked. Luna recited the prophecy. "Those dark stars will eventually return. At the juncture of old and new, the resurrected Medea will face crisis." Everyone but Scott looked at her blankly. "That's Professor Trelawney's prophecy," Scott translated. "Professor Trelawney? Credible?" Eddie snorted. "What do you mean by dark stars?" Luna ignored his skepticism. The prophecy is true. Dark stars is another name for thestrals. But what does that have to do with the Minister of Magic? Milton pressed. Luna thinks the juncture of old and new refers to a change of minister. Scott explained. Luna nodded solemnly. Savannah thought it meant the arrival of 1994, but it's already 1994 and the thestrals haven't returned, so she must have been wrong. Maybe it's all nonsense, Eddie muttered. You can be forgiven for not believing, Scott said, smiling. Trelawney does say a lot of odd things, Luna insisted, but sometimes what she says is true. I saw it. She opened her third eye when she spoke that prophecy. Third eye? Eddie's chubby face crinkled in disbelief. Scott suspected Eddie thought Luna even crazier than Trelawney. The carriages reached the gates of Hogwarts. Scott and his friends climbed out and headed for the Great Hall. Eddie grumbled, "The Evening Prophet's a bit late today." No one else read that paper, so his complaint went unanswered. Inside the Great Hall, they sat at the long tables, and at last, a few owls delivered late newspapers. "Seems the Prophet isn't selling well," and Roger said with a grin. "Oh, look!" Eddie unfolded his copy and exclaimed, "Gringotts has been invaded again." His shout drew everyone's attention, especially Scott's. He had thought of the missing locket the moment Eddie raised his voice. Eddie set the paper on the table. The front page blazed two huge lines. "Gringotts suffers direct invasion. Goblins have betrayed our trust. Oh, those damn goblins, good for nothing but casting galleons. Greedy creatures." Across the hall, people muttered and cursed. Scott scanned the article. "Oh, Merlin, it's the resurrected Medea again," Eddie cried. "They're riding Hogwarts thestrals." To him, Medea's new nickname was the only thing he seemed to have taken from the prophecy. "It happened this afternoon," Roger said. "We were still on the train." Scott read on. That afternoon, Medea, clad in green robes, had descended on thestrals, broken through Gringotts' defenses at terrifying speed, and used Imperio to force a goblin to open an underground vault. By the time Aurors arrived, she and her followers had flown off on thestrals. The vault belonged to the Lestrange family. Unsurprisingly, Medea had made off with Hufflepuff's cup, one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. "Goblins claim Gringotts suffered no losses," Eddie scoffed. "They're lying. Think they expect to avoid paying compensation?" Roger grumbled. Scott sat back, thinking. If Medea now had the cup, he feared the locket hidden in Black's house might already be gone too. If true, Voldemort's 7 Horcruxes would be reduced to only the one inside Harry, if that was even the case. Scott mentally criticized the Dark Lord's carelessness and tried to predict Medea's next move. She would surely need a potent magical power source to complete the sacrifices that would speed her resurrection. Such places were rare. Where would she strike next? If Medea's ambitions reached beyond Britain, she had many options Scott couldn't foresee. The most anxious person, he thought, would be Voldemort himself. He knew what Medea sought and would have to try every means to stop her unless he was powerless. "It's not the first time," Eddie said loudly. "Gringotts is clearly not safe. I won't keep money there anymore." "Spoken as if you have a fortune," Roger scoffed. "Of course I will," Eddie assured them confidently. By then, Dumbledore and the other professors had arrived and taken their seats at the teacher's table. The students were still buzzing about the article, so many hadn't noticed. Professor McGonagall tapped her goblet with her wand. "Silence, please." Her voice carried, and the Great Hall quieted. "I trust everyone had a pleasant holiday," Dumbledore said cheerfully. "Welcome back to Hogwarts. Before we fill your minds with new knowledge, let us first fill your stomachs." He snapped his fingers, and mountains of food appeared on the tables. At the Ravenclaw table, Eddie grabbed a chicken leg and bit into it, muttering, "Does Dumbledore even know about the news?" "Even if he does, he won't tell us," Scott said, taking a bowl of colorful, thick soup to warm himself before reaching for the meat. Eddie persisted. Could the prophecy mean Dumbledore will become the new minister and lead the ministry to defeat the resurrected Medea? If so, the Thestrals would come back. Luna, sitting next to Scott, looked up at Dumbledore and shook her head. "Dumbledore will not become minister." "How do you know?" Eddie asked, food-covered lips pouting. "If he wanted the job, he'd have become minister long ago," Roger said. That seemed a solid point, even Eddie couldn't counter. The opening feast passed without further announcements. Though the professors were whispering at the teacher's table, they never spoke of the Gringotts' attack to the students. After the feast, the students drifted off to their common rooms. With no first years to guide, Scott, his 3 roommates, and Luna ambled through the castle together. As they walked down a corridor, Scott saw Harry running up to Black, voice excited. Black looked across the crowd and caught Scott's eye, then waved. "Looks like I have to go," Scott told his friends and Luna, and joined Black and Harry. "Good evening, Professor Black," Scott said. "Hello, Scott," Black replied, smiling. "Come, both of you, come to my office with me." Scott nodded. Scott and Harry followed Black into his office. He pushed the door open, crossed to the sofa by the window, sank down, and beckoned them to sit. "Come, please sit." They took the seats opposite him. "Professor Black," Scott began, "may I ask what you wanted to see me about?" Black leaned back and smiled, pleased. "I have to thank you, Scott. Harry told me about your guess." Scott shot a look at Harry. "I was only guessing wildly when we were talking," he protested. "That doesn't matter." Black looked at Harry. "Harry, you don't need to pay attention to that useless good-for-nothing creature." He pronounced the house elf's name with obvious loathing. "The reason I called you both here isn't only that," he added, turning to Scott. "But your guess might be right." Harry shifted in his seat, agitated. "I still think something's wrong with Creature suddenly going mad," he said. "He was always difficult, but not like this. Maybe what he said has a kernel of truth. Did you hear him? He was talking about something Regulus left behind, maybe one of your family relics. You should ask him properly." "He's completely unhinged now. He can't speak clearly," Scott pointed out. Black's expression soured into disgust. "Maybe it's nothing important. You know, Creature, if Regulus left even a stone, he'd treat it like treasure." He spat the words. Then, more bitterly, "That fool Regulus, you know who must have killed him. If it weren't for my parents' twisted ideas, he never would have joined the Death Eaters so young. They killed him." His hatred for his family was plain. Harry's voice rose. "He didn't necessarily die. He disappeared. You should talk to Creature properly. Maybe he has a clue. Don't you want to know what happened to Regulus?" Black's face softened for a moment. "You're right, Harry. I have to find Regulus, dead or alive." The calm lasted only a beat before anger flared again. "Talk properly." His gaunt features hardened. "I'll get to the bottom of it. That useless servant can't hide anything from his master." At that moment, Lupin pushed the door open and came in with a tray of steaming cups. "Evening," he said. "What are you lot plotting?" Harry quickly told him what they'd been discussing. Lupin listened, then set a cup in front of each of them. Scott thanked him. Lupin turned to Black. "You should listen to Harry. Your attitude toward house elves isn't good. That could get you into trouble." Black waved the rebuke off with a half smile. "Don't worry. Can that useless creature really resist his master?" Lupin shook his head and fell silent. "Enough of that," Black said, dismissing the subject. He stood and walked to his desk. "I called you for another reason. I brought you a little gift to thank you for helping catch that Peter fellow." He picked up a worn notebook and handed it to Scott. "Your best subject is Transfiguration," he said. "This is an old notebook I found at home. It should be useful." Scott opened it. On the first page, someone had written Phineas Black. "That was my great-great-grandfather," Black said. "He was once headmaster of Hogwarts." Scott flipped through the pages and found meticulous notes, a method of becoming an animagus, but not the usual ritual, something specific to the House of Black. He hesitated. "This is very valuable, Professor. I'm not sure I can accept it," he said. He'd heard that the Blacks' animagus knowledge was different, simpler, safer, and inherited like a family magic. It was part of a pure-blood legacy. Black laughed softly. "It's fine." He sank back down. "Once you read it carefully, you'll see the House of Black's method isn't remarkable." He shrugged. "You don't have black blood, anyway. It will only serve as a reference for you. When I was at Hogwarts, I shared it with a few friends. James Potter, Lupin. James was talented at Transfiguration, and my notes helped him. And of course, Peter. Peter only became an animagus with the help of James and me." Scott examined the notebook more closely and found Black was right. The technique was simpler and safer, but also narrowly focused. It applied specifically to the canine transformation the Blacks used. He closed the book and looked at the Black family crest on the cover, a shield with a chevron, 2 stars, a short sword, and 2 rampant greyhounds. "Thank you, Professor Black," Scott said, this time accepting it. After leaving the office, he went back to his dorm, showered, and then began to study the century-old notebook with care. By bedtime, he'd formed a preliminary understanding of the Black animagus method. It was indeed aimed at descendants who could continue the family line. For Scott, it could only be a reference. Still, the notes revealed another side of the pure-blood obsession with bloodlines. The continuity they guarded was not merely about status. Magical inheritances, techniques and charms tied to blood, could be lost or diluted if the line was broken. When a family's blood changed, so did the living repository of their magic. At breakfast the next morning, Scott split his attention between the Slytherin table and the conversation at Harry's. Over in Slytherin, Millicent Bulstrode, who'd been engaged to the new Travers heir and had missed a semester, had returned. Tall, with black hair and a solid, blunt-featured face, she accepted compliments about her future position as mistress of the Travers estate with an aggressive smugness. Scott couldn't help thinking the Foley family's choice of heir had been a steep price to pay for that alliance. More important, however, was what Harry had told his friends about a dream. Harry had woken terrified and confided the dream to Ron. Scott, within earshot, learned the details. In the dream, Harry found himself in the body of an infant, or rather, he realized too late he was seeing through the infant's eyes, and a young man was carrying him into a sea-hidden cliff cave. When the child began to speak, Harry realized he was not inhabiting a real infant, but Lord Voldemort. The young man carried Voldemort into the cave. There he woke a multitude of Inferi from a lake hidden within. They made a bridge of their bodies across the water, and Voldemort strode along it to a small island in the center. On that island, he raged and howled with a fury that seemed endless because the thing he had hidden there had been taken. He bellowed, "Unforgivable! I must regain my strength! I must! Now!" Harry woke with a start. From what Scott had heard, the Slytherin locket must indeed have slipped into someone else's hands. Medea's, it seemed. If the portrait of former headmaster Phineas Black were loyal to Medea, as Scott suspected, she would be able to find her way into the Black House as soon as she had a clue to the locket's whereabouts. Scott also knew Voldemort's current state, weakened, urgent. That rage in Harry's dream was not just fury, but terror at his own weakness. Faced with Medea pressing for power, Voldemort, desperate to recover, would be likely to take reckless action. He would not necessarily wait for the Triwizard Tournament months from now to make a move, unlike what had happened before. "Oh, today's Daily Prophet is still on this," Eddie said, breaking Scott's thoughts. "Those goblins still want tight control over wizard vaults," he scoffed. "The Ministry is being tougher this time." Scott glanced at the paper in Eddie's hands. The front page headline blazed, "Ministry of Magic forcefully takes over Gringotts. Goblins protest en masse." "The Ministry of Magic isn't taking over Gringotts," Dylan said from across the long table, folding his newspaper. "Gringotts is international," Kayla, who sat beside him, added. "The British Ministry is only moving to regulate Gringotts' security." "Oh, the Daily Prophet, always trying to rile people with its headlines," Eddie snapped, shoving the paper away. "Let me see." Scott reached for the newspaper and skimmed it. The article matched what Dylan and Kayla had said. To ensure the safety of property owned by British witches and wizards, the Ministry of Magic has dispatched a contingent of senior Aurors to Gringotts Bank in Britain. These experienced Aurors will oversee Gringotts' security matters. "Even so, the goblins won't be happy," Eddie said. "Goblins are greedy by nature. They already consider everything in Gringotts to be theirs." "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Roger said with a smile. "Fewer wizards will probably feel confident leaving valuables at Gringotts from now on." "They still haven't put the exact stolen item in the paper," Scott said, folding the newspaper. "Yesterday's issue said a Lestrange vault was breached," Milton interjected. "Most of the Lestranges are in Azkaban now." "No surprise," Eddie shrugged. "If the vault belonged to Lestrange, they'll decline responsibility for the theft, for now at least." For the students at Hogwarts, even a major story like a breach at Gringotts was only dinner table conversation. Beyond what the paper printed, they had no access to further details. Scott, however, wanted more. After morning classes, he met Lambo in the Forbidden Forest and asked him to send his crows to gather intelligence. "Keep both Gringotts and the Ministry under surveillance," Scott told him. "I have a feeling something significant is about to happen in the British magical world." "What makes you say that?" Lambo asked. Scott shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but there will be change." "All right, I'll have the crows do their best." Lambo agreed, and over the following days his flock shuttled between London and Hogwarts. Scott saw him more often, and through the crows' scouting, he learned things that hadn't been reported. First, the stolen item from the Lestrange vault had indeed been verified. It was Hufflepuff's cup. To confirm the loss, the Ministry not only audited Gringotts' vault inventories, but had also sent investigators to Azkaban to question Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange and Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix's furious screaming when told of the theft made it clear to the Ministry that the cup had been entrusted to Lestrange by the Dark Lord himself. Lambo had noticed other oddities at the Ministry. Minister Fudge had grown unusually taciturn, and several members of the Minister's Office Secretary's Department had begun holding secret meetings with people from other departments behind his back. Fudge was furious. Lambo said his face would darken like a brewing storm, but he did not explicitly forbid the meetings. "The Minister's Office Secretary's Department?" Scott murmured when Lambo mentioned it. "Milton's father, Mr. Greaves, is head of that department, isn't he?" Scott said, feeling a small confirmation click into place. Lambo tilted his head. "I don't know Milton's father, but there is indeed a Mr. Greaves there." "Keep at it." Scott stroked Lambo's feathers. "Medea will be busy digesting the Horcrux she got. She won't be watching the Ministry closely. While we have the chance, see if you can get me a list of who attends those secret meetings. They'll all be Medea's people." "No problem," Lambo said. The days that followed fell into the same high-intensity study schedule Scott had kept the previous semester. Even weekends were full, except when Ravenclaw had Quidditch matches. The Gringotts story cooled off in the press. Then in the first week of February, Professor Black began missing Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons, leaving only his assistant, Lupin, to teach. Lupin didn't say where Black was, and students began to whisper. Scott, however, had already guessed why. On the second day after Black's disappearance, Scott received a letter from Dumbledore at noon asking him to come to the headmaster's office. Harry was already there when Scott arrived. "Good afternoon, Scott," Dumbledore said, waving him in from behind his desk. "Come and sit. What would you like to drink?" "Black tea. No sugar, thank you." Scott took the stool next to Harry. Dumbledore chuckled, snapped his fingers, and a steaming cup appeared. "My guess was right," Dumbledore said. Harry, bright-eyed with excitement, blurted out, "Creature really knows the truth about Regulus's disappearance." Scott set his cup down and listened. "Is Regulus alive?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Harry answered. "Sirius didn't tell me everything. He said he learned something and was very excited." "Where is Professor Black?" Scott pressed. "Let me explain," Dumbledore said, leaning back. "Sirius contacted me. It was a significant discovery." He sighed. "Who would have thought such a secret could be preserved in a house elf's mind?" Scott frowned. "Professor, does this require my involvement?" "I need your help, Scott." Dumbledore's smile was gentle. "Please listen." Scott hesitated, then nodded. "It concerns Lord Voldemort's Horcrux," Dumbledore said softly. "Horcrux?" Harry looked puzzled. He had not yet had the same exposure to the concept as in stories he'd heard. Dumbledore explained the dark principle and purpose of Horcruxes, and Harry's face went pale as he recalled the diary that had controlled Ginny. "That diary was also a Horcrux," Dumbledore agreed, and then turned to Scott. "You performed arithmancy on these matters. Your calculations suggested that, whether by design or accident, Voldemort created 7 Horcruxes." Harry's brow nodded. "So we have to destroy all of them to defeat him?" "Theoretically, yes," Dumbledore said. He hesitated, then added, "Is the relic Regulus left behind a Horcrux?" "I'm afraid so," Dumbledore replied, "and, unfortunately, it has been stolen." Harry's eyes widened. "Could Voldemort have taken it? I dreamed of him." "Harry?" Dumbledore's clear blue eyes sharpened. "Tell me what you dreamed." "It was just a dream," Harry protested, reluctant. "It doesn't mean anything." "Actually, dreams can mean a great deal, especially yours," Dumbledore said gently. At Dumbledore's urging, Harry recounted the dream. While Harry spoke, Scott's gaze drifted to the portraits of former headmasters dressed on the office wall. They looked asleep enough, but their slightly open eyes betrayed them. One portrait in particular, Phineas Black, seemed to move subtly. Scott frowned. If word reached Medea that Harry could see Voldemort through dreams, she might conclude Harry was a Horcrux, or at least use him as a detector for Voldemort's presence. When Harry finished, Dumbledore said quietly, "Harry, what you saw in your dream really happened." "How could that be?" Harry asked, bewildered. "It was only a dream." Before Dumbledore could answer, Scott spoke up. "Is it because of the prophecy?" The power of the prophecy created a connection between Harry and Voldemort. Dumbledore looked surprised, but did not contradict him. "That theory does make sense," he said. "What prophecy?" Harry asked blankly. "Why have I never heard of it?" Dumbledore turned his benign gaze to Scott. Scott explained, "There was a prophecy made over a decade ago about you and Voldemort. When Voldemort heard it, he decided to eliminate you. Of course, that attempt led to his downfall. Just because of a prophecy?" Harry found the idea hard to accept, but his glance at Dumbledore told him Scott's words were true. "Why do you know this?" Harry asked Scott. "Some of the portraits and ghosts in this castle know about it," Scott said evenly. "They generally don't tell others." He had discussed the subject before with Helena. It was not something the castle kept secret from all its inhabitants. Harry looked stricken and puzzled. Can a prophecy really be that powerful? Can it create a link between me and Voldemort? He still struggled to accept that such a thing could be true. 338. The last Horcrux facing Harry's question, Scott shook his head. "I was only guessing wildly." He turned to Dumbledore. Dumbledore smiled. "That is possible. In magic, no one can claim complete mastery." "All right," Harry said reluctantly. "Is there any way to break this connection?" He looked at Dumbledore with hopeful eyes. Dumbledore's expression grew apologetic. "I'm afraid not. I think only by defeating Lord Voldemort completely can this problem be solved." He glanced at Harry's clenched fist, then turned to Scott and began to speak about Horcruxes. "After I received Sirius's message, I went to the Black family house and learned what I could from Creature, then went with Sirius to the sea cave from Harry's dream." His expression became solemn. Regulus was a hero. He discovered Voldemort's secret long ago, and to destroy one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, he sacrificed his life. For some reason, Dumbledore recounted Regulus Black's story in patient detail for Scott and Harry. Regulus had been a pure-blood supremacist and an early follower of Voldemort, joining the Death Eaters at 16. Voldemort had once asked him to recommend a house elf for an experiment, and he suggested Creature, the Black's house elf. But Creature returned terrified, and something about his behavior tipped Regulus off. He became suspicious of Voldemort. Regulus later returned to the sea cave where Voldemort kept a Horcrux, drank the potion guarding it, and swapped the locket, Slytherin's locket. He handed the locket to Creature and ordered him to destroy it. Regulus himself was dragged under by Inferi and drowned. "When we arrived," Dumbledore said softly, "the Horcrux had already been severely damaged, but we found Regulus's body and gave him a proper burial." Regulus was remarkable," Harry said, voice tinged with sadness. "Sirius never knew any of this. He used to call Regulus a fool." Sirius was clearly heartbroken. He blamed himself. Dumbledore's voice deepened. "He told me that if he hadn't run away from his family, his younger brother wouldn't have had to face the Dark Lord." "He's right," an unfamiliar voice snapped. All three turned to the talking portrait over the fireplace. Phineas Black had pushed his painted eyelids fully open. His face was scornful. "It was Sirius's rebellion that led to Regulus's death," he declared angrily. Harry bristled. "Who are you?" he demanded. Phineas looked down with disdain. "I am a former headmaster of Hogwarts, and the great-great-grandfather of Sirius and Regulus." Harry, surprised by the claim, still stood up to argue. "Why blame Sirius? That's Voldemort's fault, and if the Blacks hadn't been obsessed with Voldemort, Regulus wouldn't have become a Death Eater." "You Potter boy, do you know whom you are talking to?" Phineas roared. "It was your father, James Potter, who led Sirius astray." "They were friends because they liked each other," Harry shot back. "They weren't to blame." Phineas was about to retort when a hand reached from a neighboring portrait and clapped over his mouth. "Quiet, Phineas." A witch with long, curly silver hair in the top row spoke. Her voice was gentle but carried authority. "We are portraits. We should not point fingers at the living." Scott looked up. The speaker was Dilys Derwent, one of Hogwarts's most respected headmistresses and a famed healer. Her portrait hung also in St. Mungo's. Reluctantly, the wizard who had been shouting released his grip. Phineas's face darkened with displeasure, but he fell silent. "Thank you, Dilys," Dumbledore said with a small smile. Phineas's expression only deepened. Dumbledore gestured for Harry to sit. "Sit down, Harry." Then he turned to Scott. "I would like you to perform arithmancy for us one more time, Scott." Scott nodded. "About the Horcruxes?" "Yes, about Voldemort's Horcruxes." Dumbledore's expression grew serious. "Voldemort made 7 Horcruxes in total. The ones we know of are Tom Riddle's diary, Ravenclaw's diadem, Slytherin's locket, and Hufflepuff's cup. The diadem, too? And the cup?" Harry interrupted, astonished. Dumbledore nodded. "Ravenclaw's diadem has been purified. The cup was stolen from Gringotts at the beginning of the school year." He paused. "According to Lestrange, the owner of the vault, the cup was handed to them by Voldemort for safekeeping." Harry's eyes widened. "So the cup fell into the hands of Salazar Slytherin's descendant?" "Not only the cup." Dumbledore's voice was grave. "I suspect Slytherin's locket was taken as well, and there is more." He sipped his tea. "When I searched the gaunt old house, I found traces that someone had taken something from there before I arrived. At that time, Miss Slytherin, Medea, had not been away from Hogwarts for long." Scott lowered his gaze to the steaming cup in his hands. "If Voldemort really hid a Horcrux at the Gaunt house, then Medea must have at least 3 Horcruxes under her control. Considering the 2 destroyed or purified here at Hogwarts, that would leave only 2 Horcruxes unaccounted for," Dumbledore added. Scott picked up his wand. "I'll try, but I may not get a clear result." "Wait," Harry protested. He still looked confused. "Why would Miss Slytherin's descendant collect Horcruxes? Is she working with Voldemort?" Scott shook his head. "No, she and Voldemort are enemies. She needs to gather Voldemort's fragmented soul, to sacrifice it at once, to achieve a full resurrection." He briefly summarized the oath Medea had once made with Ravenclaw and scanned the portraits out of the corner of his eye. "There are ancient, powerful magic sites at the Merlin Order's headquarters and Edinburgh Castle," Scott continued. "I suspect Medea seized those places for their magical reservoirs so she could complete the Horcrux sacrifice ritual." "My thoughts exactly," Dumbledore agreed. Ignoring Harry, who still seemed stunned, Scott began the arithmancy. He waved his wand, and a riot of numbers erupted into the air, colliding, transforming, exploding into new figures. "Arithmancy law," he intoned. "Numbers manifest." The numbers shimmered, breaking into golden motes that drifted down until a single figure formed, the numeral 1. It rose towards Scott. He extended his empty left hand, caught it, and closed his eyes for a moment. "This is arithmancy?" Harry murmured. "It looks a lot more reliable than reading tea leaves in divination." Scott opened his eyes. "Only 1 left," he told Dumbledore. "Medea didn't get 3 Horcruxes. She got 4. Dumbledore's surprise was brief. He recovered quickly. "No wonder Voldemort was so furious," he murmured. As Harry saw in his dream, his rage almost destroyed that cave. Harry brightened at once. "Isn't that good? If we can find the remaining Horcruxes, we might be able to defeat Voldemort completely." "That is true, in theory." Scott picked up his teacup again. "But who knows? Medea might become a far worse Dark Lord than Voldemort." He kept watching the portraits, and this time the faint anger flare across Phineas Black's painted face. Harry nodded in agreement. "You're right, Scott. After all, she is a descendant of Slytherin." Dumbledore's voice took on a practical tone. "Harry, how are you doing in your dueling class and the dueling club?" He was clearly thinking of Harry's safety. Harry flushed. "My dueling grades are fine, but I don't know as many charms as Hermione." "Don't worry," Dumbledore said with a reassuring smile. "Dueling skill isn't simply the number of charms you know." After asking a few more questions, Dumbledore dismissed them. Scott prepared to leave with Harry, but Harry hesitated. "Professor, I'd like to see Sirius." Dumbledore considered, then nodded. He told Scott to make himself comfortable and took Harry with him through the fireplace. After they left, only Scott remained in the office. He made no unnecessary movements. He rose, gathered his things, and left as well. One morning at the end of January, Scott received an unsigned package while eating breakfast in the Great Hall. Luna, sitting opposite him, glanced at the square parcel wrapped in parchment and guessed, "Is it from Savannah?" "It should be," Scott said, his hand resting on the package as he felt the unique pulse of magic within. That magic could only have come from the oaks of the Oak Sea. "I won't open it here," he added when Luna tilted her head. "There are too many people." "It's not convenient," Luna agreed, retracting her gaze. Eddie, who sat next to Scott, couldn't help himself. "Why can't the package Savannah sent be opened in a crowded place?" His voice grew louder, curiosity pushing it out. Scott turned and fixed him with a look. Eddie fell silent. Scott patted his shoulder and smiled. Luna laughed. Roger and Milton, who had been staring at the parcel, looked away at the same moment. "Scott," Roger whispered, "remember, Savannah's only 12. "I know," Scott answered, expression unchanged. Roger shrugged. "Well then, there's nothing between you two." Scott smiled and murmured back, "Of course I'm different from you," and deliberately glanced toward Leisha Dupin at the far end of the long table. Roger immediately averted his eyes as if burned. Scott's smile broadened. After breakfast, Scott tucked the package into his shifting lizard skin satchel. He didn't take it out again until that evening, after returning from Charm Club to the Ravenclaw common room. The common room had quieted down. Scott walked to a corner, sat, and peeled back the outer parchment. Inside was a square, dark wooden box. Luna, who had been reading by the fireplace, drifted over and asked in her usual unhurried voice, "Are you going to open it? Can I see?" Scott slid his hand over the lid, feeling the oak leaf carving under his thumb. "Will I be in danger if I open it?" he asked. "No," Luna said with certainty after a careful look. "You won't be in danger." Scott opened the box. Inside sat an acorn the size of a fist. "A golden acorn?" Luna breathed. "Golden?" Scott examined it. Apart from its size, it looked like a normal acorn, brown and smooth. "It's golden," Luna repeated seriously. Scott didn't argue. He picked it up. Uncovered, the acorn blazed on his senses with an astonishing flood of deep, ancient magic. It was heavy in his hand and humming. Savannah hadn't included a letter, so Scott had no instructions. "Maybe you can eat it?" Luna suggested. "Are you sure?" Scott asked. "I'm guessing," she admitted with a shrug. "Let's just keep it for now," Scott decided, and put the acorn back in the wooden box. Luna nodded, pleased. "It looks like Savannah's trial worked," she said. Scott agreed. Over a month had passed, and Savannah should have been promoted to Druid Priest. The next day, another envelope arrived from Savannah. This time there was a letter, hastily written and messy. Scott read it carefully. "Are you well, Scott? I have successfully been promoted to priest. I'm sorry, I didn't have much time to leave the Oak Sea, so when I sent you the sacred tree fruit, I didn't have time to write. I don't have much time now either. That is the best sacred tree fruit. You can bind to it with magic. Keep it with you. It speeds up magical recovery and brings luck. I sealed a spell inside it, one only druid priests use. If you're in danger, you can summon it. The incantation is Root of the Sacred Tree. Using the spell won't harm the sacred tree fruit, but after one use, it needs about a day to be ready again." Savannah Scott smiled at the slyness of the gift. Savannah clearly hadn't wanted her family to know. Even without the promise of luck or the sealed spell, the fruit's ability to speed magical recovery was valuable enough. That evening, he took the fruit to a charm practice room he summoned in the Room of Requirement and tested it. Unlike the fiddly process required to activate the severed arm bone, Scott established a connection to the sacred tree fruit easily. He drained his magic with a few charms and felt his magic return noticeably faster. Then he tested the sealed spell. Root of the Sacred Tree, he intoned. Several thick roots exploded through the stone tiles beneath his feet, lashing outward in a sweeping arc and cracking the practice room floor. A few seconds later, they withered and collapsed into a mess. Scott raised an eyebrow. The power was impressive. He left the Room of Requirement and summoned the portrait of Ravenclaw, Helena's study, to tell her about the fruit. Ravenclaw smiled, unsurprised. "Magic is, in theory, an omnipotent force," she said. "Druids and wizards simply use it differently." Her calm, insightful take took some of the novelty out of the discovery for Scott, and the matter passed. February began with an even busier schedule for him. He practiced Transfiguration more frequently, now that his recovery was faster. Just when he might have forgotten Medea, she made a scene again. On February 13th, 1994, the day before Valentine's Day, Miss Medea Slytherin dominated the front page of the Daily Prophet. She, the resurrected witch, had granted an exclusive interview to Rita Skeeter. The headline read, "Exclusive Interview, Medea Slytherin, Ending Mistakes, Restarting the Future." Subhead, "Spanning a Millennium, Unchanged in Purpose, she will bring a better tomorrow to the magical world." The Great Hall fell silent when the paper was spread out. Conversation resumed in a rush of disbelief and outrage. Medea Slytherin? The witch who killed Professor Lockhart and Yaxley after her resurrection? That Slytherin who attacked the Merlin Order's stronghold? The one who took Edinburgh Castle? She even broke into Gringotts. Bring a better tomorrow? What a joke. Maybe there's more to it. She had difficulties? Does having difficulties justify killing people? The people she killed weren't good people. Don't say nonsense. Then Eddie jumped up, waving the paper. Look, Slytherin has openly declared war on you-know-who. All eyes swiveled to the newspaper as students leaned in. Scott skimmed past Rita's polite opening and into the interview proper. The exchange read like this. Rita asked why, after all the sensational acts she'd committed, Medea had agreed to an interview and whether she'd had a change of heart. Medea, insisting on being called Medea, said yes, she had changed her mind because a bad reputation would only make the things she wanted to do harder. What did she want? To make the magical world, the future of wizards, better. When Rita pressed for specifics, Medea said bluntly that everything she had done before had been to destroy Tom, Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. She had spoken the name, and she had used the word Horcrux. By the time Scott finished that line, others around him had as well. The Great Hall erupted into a cacophony of exclamations the moment they saw the name Lord Voldemort. 340. Voldemort is just a half-blood. At that moment the students, all of them staring at the newspapers, asked the same question aloud in unison. What is a Horcrux? No one in the Great Hall could answer. Scott and Harry knew the truth, of course, but neither of them intended to explain. The rest of the hall had to keep reading. The interview printed there was explosive. Yes, an extremely evil dark artifact, Lord Voldemort's secret to immortality, a Horcrux. Are you saying you-know-who isn't dead yet? Do you have any evidence for this? Everyone knows he's been gone for ages. Evidence? No evidence needed. I believe you'll see him very soon, now that all his Horcruxes are about to disappear. Please elaborate. Lord Voldemort created a total of 6 Horcruxes, plus his main soul, making the magical number 7. To date, Mr. Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, has purified 2 of those 6, and I have purified 3. Furthermore, I recently secured the last one. Reading that, Scott understood Medea's intention immediately. She had deliberately held something back. She knew what Scott's arithmancy calculation in the headmaster's office had shown. Voldemort's Horcrux count totaled 7, but the last one had been accidental, possibly even unknown to Voldemort himself. She also knew Voldemort would almost certainly read this interview, so she had left out the accidental Horcrux on purpose, sure that Dumbledore and Scott, who already knew the truth, would not contradict her. Medea's real goal wasn't simply to clear her name, as Scott had briefly supposed. It was to force whoever was hiding in the shadows to show himself. She now claimed to hold Voldemort's final Horcrux. If Voldemort did not appear before she purified it, he would be stripped of his anchor to immortality. Of course, he could respond by creating more Horcruxes, if a soul already so fragmented could bear that further mutilation. Scott smiled at the thought and read on. Are you saying you and Dumbledore are collaborating to deal with you-know-who? Collaboration? No. We've always gone our separate ways. It just happens we temporarily share the same goal. There was meaning in that guarded answer. Scott believed Medea was baiting the issue, trying to implicate Dumbledore without letting him answer. He chuckled. Dumbledore could hardly denounce this publicly without creating a panic. So through your combined efforts, you-know-who is nearly defeated? You could say that. To destroy such malignant dark artifacts as Horcruxes, I had to tap vast reserves of magic. That's why the sources of magic at the Merlin Order's headquarters and Edinburgh Castle were drained. You attacked the Merlin Order and Edinburgh Castle to purify Horcruxes? Yes, It caused alarm and inconvenience, but that is my explanation. Do you know how Dumbledore purifies Horcruxes? Hogwarts is the greatest magic castle in the world. Scott noted the insinuation. Medea was carefully suggesting she drained the Merlin Order in Edinburgh Castle to purify Horcruxes, and implying Dumbledore did the same using Hogwarts' magical source. That would be enough to cause fear. There are always idiots who would panic that Hogwarts itself was being drained, and those idiots announced themselves. From the Gryffindor table, a chorus of anxious voices rose. What? They drained the magic for this? Is Hogwarts going to lose its magic too? That concern spread quickly. Students near them echoed and exaggerated. Is this true? Is Hogwarts going to be unsafe? Could Slytherin's heir and you-know-who both break in? I want to go home. Panic rippled from a handful of Gryffindors to pockets of Hufflepuffs. The Weasley twins were laughing uproariously. Fred and George fed off each other, terrifying a few younger Gryffindors into silence. Their dramatics made the rest of Gryffindor watch amusedly rather than offering comfort. Even Percy and Hermione, who wanted to set things straight, had their protests smothered by the jeers around them. Across the hall in Hufflepuff, Cedric and a few older students were doing their best to calm younger classmates. Scott sighed. He spent a lot of time with both the Weasley twins and Cedric. It struck him afresh how different their instincts were. Even if the students later learned Dumbledore had not been draining Hogwarts' magic, worry remained. Several Ravenclaws on Scott's side were already speculating whether the castle's defenses would be weakened. If those who lived inside Hogwarts were rattled like this, what hope was there for those further from the truth? Scott turned his attention back to the paper. Rita Skeeter, or someone writing in her style, had either defected to Medea or was being used by her. That the piece appeared so openly in the Daily Prophet was the more alarming fact. The Prophet had long acted as the Ministry of Magic's mouthpiece. This suggested Medea's influence in the ministry was already deep. He continued reading. Why did you address the you-know-who issue so quickly after your return? To my knowledge, you-know-who claimed to be the heir of Slytherin. Heir? I must state that my family has no heir. However, Lord Voldemort and I do share blood. He is the child of the last pure-blood witch of the Gaunt family and a Muggle man. Merlin, forgive me. Are you saying you-know-who, that fierce proponent of pure-blood ideology, is actually a half-blood wizard himself? Yes. I know many will be surprised, but it's the truth. Scott smiled. Medea was trying to erode Voldemort's carefully constructed myth, the heir of Slytherin and the pure-blood icon. That revelation alone would send ripples through the wizarding world.